I flew to Tacoma and found my granddaughter dying alone in an intensive care unit. Her stepmother was sipping champagne on a yacht in St. Lucia, so I systematically burned her entire world to the ground. 48 hours later, she was standing barefoot in a prison cell begging for a mercy she never showed my blood. My name is Garrison Cole. I am 69 years old, and for decades I investigated marine insurance fraud for the largest shipping conglomerates in the world. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to become a monster to protect the people you love. The sharp beep of a ventilator cut through the sterile air of the Tacoma hospital. That sound served as a mechanical metronome, marking the fragile boundary between life and death. I stood motionless over the metal bed. My 8-year-old granddaughter Aaliyah lay perfectly still beneath a complex tangle of transparent tubes and humming wires. Her small head was heavily wrapped in thick, white bandages hiding the catastrophic trauma within her skull. She was trapped in a deep coma. The nurses moved around her with that specific quiet urgency reserved for patients who might not make it through the night. I kept my hands folded tightly behind my back to stop them from shaking. I stared at her chest, watching the artificial rise and fall dictated by the machine. 40 years of tracking phantom cargo ships and exposing international syndicates had taught me how to detach my emotions from a crime scene. But this was not a cargo ship. This was my blood. This was the little girl who painted me crooked sunflowers and called me her favorite person in the world. I forced my breathing to slow down. I needed absolute clarity. My son Javon collapsed into a hard plastic chair in the corner of the room. He buried his face in his hands. His broad shoulders heaved with silent, dry sobs. Javon is a good man, but a soft man. I raised him to see the best in people. That was my greatest mistake. I had unknowingly left him vulnerable to predators who see kindness as weakness. He looked up at me with bloodshot eyes. He looked completely shattered. He whispered the official narrative with a trembling voice. He told me Aaliyah simply lost her footing and slipped down the grand staircase of their new mansion. He repeated the words like a programmed script. She tripped. She tumbled. It was a tragic accident. I listened to his broken voice without interrupting. I scanned the small hospital room with cold, analytical eyes. A crucial element was missing from this picture of family tragedy. Vanessa was entirely absent. The white woman Javon had married 2 years ago was nowhere to be found. A mother should be tethered to the side of a dying child. A stepmother who claimed to love Aaliyah like her own flesh and blood should be tearing down the hospital doors. I looked at Javon and asked a single direct question regarding his wife. Javon flinched at the mention of Vanessa. He stammered out a pathetic excuse that tasted like ash in the sterile room. He claimed Vanessa was currently attending an exclusive spiritual retreat on a remote island. He defended her absence by stating she had booked the trip 6 months ago to deal with severe anxiety. According to Javon, the island lacked reliable cell service and she simply could not secure a flight back to Tacoma in time. He recited these lies, looking at the linoleum floor rather than meeting my gaze. He desperately wanted to believe the fiction his wife had fed him. He needed her to be the grieving mother trapped by geographical misfortune. I did not challenge him. I did not point out the absurd logistics of a wealthy woman being unable to charter a flight during a family emergency. I simply nodded. I let the silence stretch until it became suffocating. My silence is a tool. It makes guilty people talk and innocent people reflect. Javon looked back down at his hands, unable to bear the weight of my unblinking stare. He returned to his silent weeping. I turned my attention back to the fragile, broken body of my granddaughter. I stepped closer to the bed. The fluorescent lights overhead cast harsh shadows across Aaliyah's pale skin. I leaned in and examined her left arm, resting on top of the thin hospital blanket. The hospital gown was pushed up to her shoulder, revealing her bicep. I stared at the dark purple contusions blooming against her skin. My mind shifted instantly from a grieving grandfather to a seasoned fraud investigator. I have spent my entire adult life analyzing physical damage to determine the truth behind insurance claims. Physics do not lie. Gravity obeys strict laws. Impact leaves a highly specific signature. The bruising on Aaliyah's arm did not match the chaotic random impacts of a body tumbling down a wooden staircase. A free fall creates broad, shapeless contusions where the body strikes flat, hard surfaces. I leaned closer, studying the exact pattern of the dark marks. There were 4 distinct oval-shaped bruises on the inner bicep and 1 larger overlapping bruise on the outer arm. I recognized the shape immediately. It was the undeniable signature of a forceful adult grip. Someone had grabbed Aaliyah with brutal, violent intent. Someone had squeezed her small arm tightly enough to rupture the blood vessels deep beneath the surface before she went down those stairs. The bruising was isolated and deliberate. A child falling forward down a flight of stairs would instinctively raise her arms to protect her face, resulting in scraped palms and bruised forearms. Aaliyah's hands were completely unmarked. The defensive wounds were entirely missing. She did not fall. She was thrown. She was violently shoved by someone she trusted enough to let close. I calculated the trajectory of the damage. I factored in Vanessa's convenient absence and Javon's desperate need to believe a lie. The pieces of the puzzle snapped into place with terrifying precision. Vanessa had orchestrated this. She had nearly murdered my granddaughter and then immediately fled the scene using a pre-planned spiritual retreat as her alibi. She left Javon behind to handle the police, the doctors, and the grief. She thought she had executed the perfect crime. She thought she was dealing with a foolish, grieving family who would simply accept the tragedy and move on without asking questions. A cold, dark rage ignited in the center of my chest. I did not scream. I did not grab my son by the collar and shake him awake. Hysteria accomplishes nothing. Confronting Javon right now would only cause him to defend his wife out of pure psychological denial. I swallowed the thick knot of anger lodged in my throat. I looked at Javon and told him I was going to the cafeteria. I turned my back on the humming machines. I walked out into the corridor to begin the hunt. I needed to gather the evidence to destroy her. I am Garrison Cole, 69 years old, and a former Marine insurance fraud investigator. While my granddaughter was dying in the ICU, her stepmother was sipping champagne on a yacht in St. Lucia. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to become a monster to protect the people you love. The corridor smelled of harsh bleach and stale coffee. I found a plastic chair and sat down heavily. The seat offered no comfort, but I was not seeking comfort. I pulled a black tablet from the pocket of my coat. The screen glowed to life, illuminating the lines on my face. My fingers moved across the glass with practiced precision. My entire existence revolved around finding things people desperately wanted hidden. When a $50 million cargo ship suddenly vanished off the coast of Madagascar, I was the man they sent to sift through the wreckage. I did not search the ocean floor. I searched the numbers. I tracked phantom ships by following offshore shell companies and encrypted routing numbers. I hunted professional criminals who possessed endless resources and brilliant minds. Tracking down the digital footprint of a vain, arrogant woman was barely a warm-up exercise. Vanessa maintained a curated public persona. She posted endless photos of organic meals and staged family outings. I ignored those polished public accounts. They forget that vanity requires an audience. A woman like Vanessa could never truly stay off the grid. She needed to boast. She needed somewhere to flaunt the spoils she believed she deserved. I accessed specialized tracking software for my corporate days. I cross-referenced the IP addresses associated with her phone and travel devices. It took me 4 minutes to shatter her digital firewall. The algorithm flagged a hidden burner account registered under an obscure alias. She used it exclusively for private networking with fellow grifters. I bypassed the security protocol and gained full access to her feed. The screen refreshed. A photograph materialized. My jaw tightened into stone. The image had been uploaded precisely 2 hours ago. The location tag was pinned to a luxury marina in St. Lucia. Vanessa stood on the deck of a massive private yacht. The Caribbean waters sparkled brilliantly in the background. She wore a designer bikini that caught the sunlight. A flute of champagne dangled from her manicured fingers. She looked utterly unburdened by the fact that her stepdaughter was fighting for every breath in a hospital room thousands of miles away. The most damning detail was the heavy muscular arm wrapped aggressively around her bare waist. The skin of that arm was covered in intricate tribal tattoos. It belonged to a white man whose face remained cropped out of the frame. He pulled her flush against his body in a gesture of intimate possession. I stared at the image until the details burned into my mind. I checked the digital metadata embedded within the photograph file. The internal timestamp confirmed the devastating truth. I cross-referenced the flight logs for the private airstrip near Tacoma. A chartered jet departed for the Caribbean exactly 2 hours after Aaliyah was admitted to the emergency room. She had executed a calculated escape. She shoved a defenseless child down a flight of stairs, watched her bleed, and then calmly took a car to the airport to drink champagne with her lover. Javon sat in that hospital room right now, crying over a woman who had used him as a financial stepping stone. He believed she was weeping in a spiritual retreat. Instead, she was celebrating her freedom on a $1-million boat. A violent surge of pure primal hatred threatened to consume my rationale. I wanted to smash the tablet against the concrete wall. I wanted to grab Javon, drag him to this bench, and force him to look at the monster he brought into our lives. But acting on raw emotion is how amateurs get caught. Panic and anger create mistakes. I needed a flawless strategy to dismantle her life piece by piece. I took a slow, measured breath. I imagined a heavy steel vault deep inside my chest. I took every ounce of my rage and shoved it directly into that vault. I locked the heavy door and spun the combination dial. My mind cleared instantly. The trembling in my hands ceased. My vision sharpened into cold, predatory focus. Vanessa thought she was dealing with an old, retired man. She had no idea she had just declared war on a seasoned hunter. I minimized the tracking software and pulled up my encrypted contact list. I bypassed the standard numbers and selected a private line. I pressed the call button and raised the device to my ear. The phone rang only once before it connected. Dominic Tran answered with his usual brisk efficiency. Dominic is not a standard family attorney. He is a corporate shark. He specializes in hostile takeovers, asset seizures, and financial destruction. He thrives in the gray areas of the law where money changes hands in total silence. We had worked together during my years in the marine insurance sector. He knew how I operated, and he did not ask unnecessary questions. Garrison, Dominic said smoothly. His voice carried the hum of a busy office in the background. I assume this is not a social call. You rarely reach out unless a fraudster needs to be gutted. I need you to open the war room, Dominic, I replied. My voice was dangerously flat. I am dealing with a domestic threat, a violent attack on my granddaughter. The perpetrator is fleeing the jurisdiction and attempting to secure assets. The background noise on Dominic's end vanished immediately. A heavy door clicked shut. I had his undivided attention. Give me the target parameters, Garrison. Her name is Vanessa Cole, my son's wife. I need a complete trace on every single financial account and credit line she currently possesses. I want you to monitor any attempt to move capital offshore. I am heading to my son's house to gather physical evidence. We will reconvene at your office shortly. Prepare the trust documents. I am initiating a total financial freeze. Understood, Dominic replied sharply. I am pulling her file now. I will have a digital net over her assets within 10 minutes. She will not be able to buy a cup of coffee without tripping an alarm on my screen. Good. The adjustment begins now, I stated. I ended the call and slipped the tablet back into my coat. The hum of the hospital corridor felt entirely different now. It was no longer a place of passive waiting. It was the staging ground for an execution of justice. I stood up from the plastic chair. My joints ached, but my resolve was absolute iron. Vanessa believed she had severed the final tie to her fake life. She thought she was untouchable on that yacht. I was going to pull her down to the bottom of the ocean. I walked toward the exit doors, stepping into the cold Tacoma air, ready to find the pieces she left behind. I stepped out of the hospital into the freezing Tacoma air. The damp chill bit through my coat, but my mind remained focused on the crime scene awaiting me. I hailed a cab and gave the driver the address to the gated community where Javon lived. The ride took 20 minutes. I spent that time visualizing the layout of his home. Javon had purchased the sprawling Tudor-style mansion 2 years ago right after marrying Vanessa. He wanted to give Aaliyah a fairy tale childhood. He ended up building a gilded cage controlled by a predator. The cab pulled up to the wrought iron gates. I keyed in my access code and walked up the long curving driveway. The neighborhood was dead silent. Manicured lawns and dormant rose bushes lined the path. The house itself loomed against the gray sky, projecting an illusion of perfect domestic tranquility. I unlocked the heavy oak front door and stepped into the foyer. The silence inside felt unnaturally heavy. It was the specific, oppressive quiet of a space attempting to conceal an atrocity. The air conditioning hummed faintly. A faint trace of Vanessa's expensive floral perfume still lingered in the air. I told Javon I was coming here to retrieve Aaliyah's favorite yellow fleece blanket. That was simply the alibi required to slip away from his desperate, clinging presence. I had no intention of visiting the bedroom yet. I walked directly past the hallway leading to the guest wing and stood at the base of the grand staircase. The staircase was an imposing architectural feature. It consisted of 24 polished mahogany steps curving elegantly toward the second floor. A thick, plush, cream-colored runner extended down the center of the stairs, secured by brass rods at the base of each step. The police had clearly already walked this path. They had noted the lack of foreign objects and filed their preliminary report classifying the incident as a tragic accidental fall. Law enforcement often accepts the easiest narrative when presented with a wealthy, crying homeowner in a clean house. My entire career was built on the fundamental premise that the easiest narrative is usually a manufactured lie. I placed my hand on the smooth wooden banister and began my ascent. I did not walk up the center of the carpet runner. I stepped carefully on the exposed wood at the edges, preserving the primary impact zone. I analyzed the trajectory a small 50-pound body would take if it tumbled naturally. A genuine slip produces a chaotic tumbling motion. The victim tries to grab the railing. Shoes scuff the riser faces. Hands leave frantic smudges on the polished wood. I saw absolutely none of that. The staircase was immaculately clean. The brass rods were perfectly straight. The structural integrity of a genuine accident simply did not exist here. I reached the top landing and stopped. This was the launch point. This was the exact spot where the narrative of a clumsy slip had to originate. I dropped to my knees and lowered my face inches from the carpet. I closed my eyes and let my fingertips do the seeing. Marine insurance fraud relies on detecting the smallest deviations in material stress. A microfracture in a ship hull tells the story of a deliberately orchestrated sinking. A carpet fiber tells the story of a violent shove. I dragged my hands methodically across the thick, cream-colored pile. I moved inch by inch, sweeping from the banister toward the edge of the top step. My thumbs snagged on a microscopic tear in the fabric. I opened my eyes and leaned closer. The heavy woven threads of the runner were ruptured. The damage was not visible from a standing height. It required proximity and suspicion to uncover. I pressed my fingers deep into the ruptured fibers, pushing past the padding to feel the solid mahogany plank beneath. My fingernails scraped against a jagged intrusion lodged violently into the wood. I pulled a small metal penlight from my pocket and illuminated the gouge. A sharp triangular shard of black plastic and steel was embedded deeply into the stair tread directly beneath the torn carpet. I used my pocket knife to carefully pry the object loose. It popped free and landed in my palm. I held the fragment up to the light. It was the broken bottom inch of a stiletto heel. The material was high-grade reinforced synthetic polymer wrapped in signature glossy red lacquer. It belonged to a Christian Louboutin pump. Vanessa exclusively wore Christian Louboutins. She owned dozens of pairs and flaunted them constantly as trophies of the lifestyle my son financed for her. I analyzed the physical forces required to snap a steel-reinforced heel and bury the fragment through thick carpet padding straight into solid hardwood. A woman simply standing or walking does not generate that level of localized downward kinetic energy. Snapping that heel required a violent, sudden transfer of body weight. It required someone to plant their foot with maximum force while aggressively pivoting their upper body to launch a heavy object forward. The object she launched was my granddaughter. The physical evidence perfectly corroborated the timeline in the bruising on Aaliyah's arm. Vanessa had grabbed the child tightly, planted her right foot at the edge of the stairs, and shoved her downward with all her strength. The extreme torque snapped the stiletto heel, trapping the evidence beneath the carpet pile before she fled the scene to catch her flight to St. Lucia. I wrapped the bloody heel fragment in a pristine white handkerchief and slid it deep into my coat pocket. The official police report was now completely worthless to me. I possessed the forensic key to dismantle Vanessa's entire alibi. I stood up and brushed the dust from my trousers. I needed to move quickly to secure the rest of the house before Javon realized how long I had been gone. I took one step toward the hallway leading to Aaliyah's bedroom. A sudden sharp noise shattered the oppressive silence of the mansion. A loud crash echoed from the first floor directly below my position. It sounded like heavy ceramic shattering against stone tile. The sound originated from the massive gourmet kitchen at the back of the house. The property was supposed to be completely empty. Javon had explicitly told me he gave the entire household staff the week off following the accident. Someone else was inside the house. I did not call out. I did not announce my presence. I slipped my pocket knife back into my hand and descended the grand staircase with absolute silence. The thick carpet absorbed my footsteps completely. I navigated the long corridor leading toward the kitchen, keeping my back pressed flat against the wall. The layout of the house was embedded in my memory. I reached the edge of the kitchen archway and peered around the corner. The massive marble island dominated the center of the room. A shattered ceramic vase lay in pieces across the floor. Standing frantically amid the wreckage was Rosa, the head housekeeper. She was visibly trembling and desperately shoving stacks of clothing into a large black canvas duffel bag. I stepped out of the shadows and positioned my large frame directly in the center of the kitchen archway. The massive marble island stood between us, but I commanded the only viable exit. Rosa gasped and dropped a handful of wrinkled shirts. She spun around wildly. Her dark eyes widened in absolute terror when she registered my presence. The shattered remains of the expensive ceramic vase crunched under her cheap sneakers. She had knocked it off the counter in her blind rush to pack. Her chest heaved with frantic, uneven breaths. She looked like a trapped animal facing inevitable slaughter. I did not raise my voice. I did not move toward her. I simply stood there absorbing her panic. Silence is the heaviest weapon in any interrogation. It forces the guilty mind to race and stumble. Rosa stared at me, waiting for the accusation. When I offered nothing but a cold, unblinking stare, her nerve began to disintegrate. Her hands trembled violently as she clutched the edge of the marble island for physical support. She opened her mouth to speak, but her vocal cords failed to produce a single sound. The air inside the vast kitchen turned thick and suffocating. Decades ago, I broke hardened dock workers who were being paid to look the other way while millions in stolen electronics were loaded onto outbound freighters. Those men were seasoned criminals with iron nerves. Rosa was merely a frightened housekeeper caught in a nightmare she lacked the psychological fortitude to survive. I let the silence stretch for another 10 seconds. I watched the sweat bead on her forehead. I watched her eyes dart desperately toward the heavy glass windows overlooking the dark manicured backyard. There was no escape. She knew I was Aaliyah's grandfather. She knew exactly why I was here. I finally spoke. My voice was pitched low and carried the unmistakable cadence of an executioner reading a final verdict. I asked her where she was planning to run. Rosa flinched as if I had struck her across the face. She stammered out a fragile, transparent lie about a sudden family emergency in Portland. She claimed her sister had fallen ill. She claimed she needed to leave immediately. The words fell from her lips without any conviction. She could not even meet my eyes. I took one slow, deliberate step forward into the kitchen. Her fragile lie instantly collapsed completely. I detailed the legal definition of accessory to attempted murder. I kept my tone conversational and devoid of any emotional inflection. I explained how the state of Washington prosecutes individuals who help conceal violent crimes against minors. I painted a vivid, stark picture of a maximum security women's correctional facility. I told her she would spend the next 20 years of her life locked inside a concrete box while her own family forgot she existed. I watched the blood completely drain from her face. She was not a hardened criminal. She was a pawn attempting to protect a guilty queen. The psychological pressure crushed her spine. Rosa fell to her knees, weeping hysterically. The heavy sobs echoed against the expensive stainless steel appliances and custom mahogany cabinets. She buried her face in her hands and surrendered to the immense weight of her guilt. She babbled a chaotic stream of apologies and excuses. She swore she never wanted anyone to get hurt. She swore she was just doing what she was absolutely told to do. I remained completely still. I waited for the hysteria to pass. I needed clean, actionable intelligence. I instructed her to start from the very beginning immediately. Rosa wiped her face with the back of her trembling hand. She stared at the shattered ceramic pieces on the floor. She confessed that she had been cleaning the second-floor guest bathroom. She heard Vanessa pacing in the master bedroom. Vanessa was speaking loudly on her cellular phone. She was arguing fiercely with a man named Bradley. She was discussing private jet schedules and massive offshore financial transfers. Aaliyah had been playing quietly in the adjacent hallway. The little girl had walked closer to the master bedroom door holding her favorite yellow fleece blanket. She heard every single word. Aaliyah possessed an incredibly sharp mind for an 8-year-old. She did not fully comprehend the complex financial logistics, but she understood betrayal. Rosa witnessed Aaliyah step into the doorway and confront her stepmother. The child boldly announced she was going to call her father and tell him Vanessa was leaving with a strange man. Rosa described the terrifying transformation on Vanessa's face. The polished, elegant socialite vanished. A feral, desperate monster emerged. Vanessa dropped the phone and lunged across the bedroom. Aaliyah screamed and bolted down the long carpeted hallway toward the staircase to escape the sudden violence. Rosa followed them, paralyzed by total shock. She reached the top of the landing just in time to witness the atrocity. Vanessa caught the child right at the edge of the top step. Rosa described how Vanessa's manicured hand clamped brutally around Aaliyah's small arm. The description perfectly matched the distinct, isolated bruising I had identified in the intensive care unit. Vanessa did not simply lose her balance. She planted her designer heel directly into the carpet and forcefully hurled the tiny girl downward. Rosa heard the sickening thud of the child's skull striking the wooden bottom floor, landing hard. Vanessa did not check on the bleeding, unconscious girl. She immediately turned to Rosa. She demanded absolute silence. Rosa crawled across the kitchen floor toward her partially packed black duffel bag. She unzipped the side compartment with shaking fingers. She pulled out a thick, heavy manila envelope and pushed it across the marble tiles toward my feet. The flap was unsealed. Stacks of crisp $100 bills spilled out onto the floor. Vanessa had handed her exactly $20,000 in cash. It was the price for her soul. It was the bribe to corroborate the tragic accidental fall narrative. I knelt down and gathered the scattered currency. I placed the cash back inside the manila envelope and slid it securely into the interior pocket of my heavy coat. I had secured the physical evidence of bribery and criminal conspiracy. I pulled my phone from my pocket and activated the high-definition audio recording application. I placed the device on the marble island directly in front of the weeping housekeeper. I commanded Rosa to repeat every single detail of her confession clearly into the internal microphone. She complied with absolutely no hesitation. She documented the attempted murder with devastating clarity. I tapped the screen and saved the encrypted audio file to my secure cloud server. The snare was now fully loaded. I possessed the broken stiletto heel, the bribery cash, and a recorded eyewitness confession. I had the ammunition required to completely obliterate Vanessa. Rosa remained on the floor, weeping quietly into her hands. I prepared to issue my final instructions to the broken woman. A sudden, harsh vibration interrupted the heavy silence. Rosa's cellular phone illuminated on the marble counter. The bright digital screen displayed an incoming international call. The caller identification boldly flashed Vanessa's name in stark letters. The screen of the phone belonging to Rosa illuminated the marble counter. The call vibrated aggressively against the stone. The identification flashed the name of Vanessa in stark letters. Rosa flinched violently at the noise. She looked at the device as if it were a venomous snake. Her eyes darted to my face. She waited for my command. I stared at the name, feeling a cold surge of satisfaction. Vanessa was calling to confirm her loose ends were tied. She needed absolute assurance the stiletto had been discarded and the housekeeper had vanished. I reached across the island and picked up the device. I did not answer. I pressed the button and silenced the ringing. I placed the phone back onto the counter. I instructed Rosa to ignore all communication. I ordered her to take her bag and remain out of sight until I contacted her again. I told her if she attempted to contact Vanessa, her immunity deal would be revoked. Rosa nodded frantically. She grabbed her bag and retreated into the shadows of the quarters. I walked out of the massive mansion. The freezing air hit my face as I stepped outside. The damp chill sharpened my focus. I climbed into my cab and instructed the driver to return to the hospital immediately. I leaned back against the leather seat and closed my eyes. The criminal puzzle constructed by Vanessa was fully assembled in my mind. She was executing a coordinated financial extraction. She had meticulously planned the destruction of my family. I spent my career exposing syndicates that scuttled freighters to collect fraudulent payouts. I knew exactly how greedy minds operated. They created diversions to mask the transfer of capital. The fall of Aaliyah was the diversion. The grief was the smokescreen. Vanessa was leveraging that grief to control my son while she emptied his vaults. I opened my eyes and watched the city lights blur past the window. My son was a successful real estate developer, but his heart was too soft. He loved fiercely and trusted unconditionally. Those virtues made him a magnificent father, but a perfect victim. The cab pulled up to the emergency entrance of the hospital. I paid the fare and walked swiftly through the sliding glass doors. The harsh fluorescent lighting of the intensive care unit burned my eyes as I re-entered the sterile ward. The rhythmic mechanical beeping of the ventilator welcomed me back to the nightmare. Aaliyah remained exactly as I had left her. Her small chest rose and fell in unnatural forced intervals. Javon was no longer sitting in the corner chair. He was standing near the foot of the bed, pacing nervously. His tie was pulled loose and his suit jacket was discarded on the floor. His eyes were bloodshot and swollen from hours of uninterrupted crying. He held his phone tightly in his right hand. He looked up when I entered the room. A fragile, desperate kind of hope radiated from his exhausted face. He rushed toward me and grabbed my shoulders. He announced he had finally spoken with Vanessa. He claimed she was moving heaven and earth to save his daughter. I kept my expression neutral. I asked him to explain exactly what Vanessa was doing from a remote spiritual retreat. Javon spoke rapidly. The words tumbled from his mouth in a frantic rush. He told me Vanessa had used her high society connections to locate an elite experimental neurological surgery team based in Geneva. He claimed these European doctors possessed a revolutionary medical procedure that could repair severe cranial trauma and reverse the coma. Javon stated the medical team was on standby, waiting to fly a private surgical unit directly to Tacoma. There was only one obstacle. The Swiss team required an immediate upfront payment of $2 million to secure the flight and equipment. Javon ran his hands over his face. He confessed his liquid capital was tied up in commercial real estate projects. He did not have $2 million in liquid cash. I listened to the absolute absurdity of the lie. Elite Swiss surgeons do not demand multi-million-dollar wire transfers to a private joint account before boarding an airplane. Experimental neurological procedures are not procured through a frantic phone call from a spiritual retreat. It was a classic advance fee scam wrapped in the emotional extortion of a dying child. Vanessa recognized the desperate need Javon harbored for a miracle. She manufactured a phantom medical team and handed him a fake lifeline. Javon looked at me with wildly desperate eyes and announced his immediate solution. He was taking out an emergency second mortgage on the mansion. He stated he had already contacted his private broker. The broker was expediting the paperwork to push the loan through by tomorrow morning. Javon planned to wire the entire sum directly into an offshore joint account that Vanessa managed. He truly believed his loving wife was personally coordinating the final payment to the Swiss doctors. Her criminal scheme was utterly breathtaking. She used his unimaginable pain to drain his remaining equity. She intended to steal $2 million and vanish, leaving him bankrupt and mourning a murdered child. The urge to scream the truth into his face was nearly overwhelming. I wanted to pull the bloody stiletto heel from my pocket and slam it onto the hospital tray. I wanted to play the tearful confession from Rosa directly into his ear. I wanted to force him to see that his beloved wife was a violent, predatory monster. I clenched my jaw so hard my teeth ached. I simply could not tell him. Javon was standing on the absolute precipice of a total psychological collapse. If I shattered his illusion of Vanessa right now, his mind would snap. He needed to believe in the Geneva doctors, because he needed to believe Aaliyah could be saved. The truth would destroy his fragile sanity. I had to protect him from the reality of his own wife until I secured the perimeter. I reached out and placed a steadying hand on his trembling shoulder. I told him he was a good father doing everything right. I offered him empty, comforting platitudes while my cold mind calculated the necessary countermeasure. I could not stop him from loving Vanessa tonight, but I could certainly stop the sudden flow of his money. I needed to sever the financial artery before she bled him dry. I patted his back gently and said that I immediately needed to use the restroom. I turned and walked out of the intensive care unit. I bypassed the public restrooms and pushed through the heavy fire doors leading into the isolated concrete stairwell. The heavy door slammed shut instantly, cutting off the hospital noise. The stairwell was freezing and completely silent. I pulled my secure cellular phone from my coat pocket and brought up the private number for Dominic Tran. Vanessa thought she could manipulate the banking system from a yacht in the Caribbean. She was about to discover the devastating power of a blind trust. I pressed the call button and held the phone to my ear. I prepared to initiate the financial slaughter. The automatic doors of the intensive care unit slid open with a mechanical hiss. The harsh fluorescent lights washed the corridor in a sickly, artificial pale glow. I walked past the nurse's station with heavy, deliberate steps, keeping my posture rigid. My wool coat still carried the biting chill of the Tacoma night air. The digital freeze initiated from Dominic Tran's secure downtown office was already rippling through the global financial network. I knew the exact mathematical velocity of a rejected wire transfer. I knew the absolute panic it induced in a predator expecting a massive payday. I entered the small private waiting room designated for Aaliyah's family. Javon was no longer sitting in the plastic chair. He paced the short length of the linoleum floor like a trapped animal. His face was entirely devoid of color. He clutched his cellular phone in his right hand, gripping the device so tightly his knuckles had turned completely white. He looked up when I crossed the threshold. His eyes were wide and frantic, looking for any kind of salvation. He opened his mouth to speak, but the sudden sharp ringing of his phone cut him off. The customized ringtone pierced the quiet space. The bright digital screen illuminated his trembling fingers. The caller identification displayed Vanessa's name in bold black letters. Javon let out a desperate, ragged gasp. He immediately accepted the call and pressed the speaker button, holding the device out in front of him as if it were a fragile lifeline. He desperately needed to hear his wife offer comfort. He needed her to validate the horrific nightmare swallowing his world. Vanessa did not offer any comfort. She offered only weaponized hysteria. Her voice exploded through the small digital speaker in a relentless barrage of shrill, panicked screams. She wailed loudly that she was standing completely alone at a private aviation terminal on a remote island. She painted a highly vivid and frantic picture of a grieving mother desperately trying to charter an emergency flight back to her dying stepdaughter. She sobbed heavily into the tiny microphone. She falsely claimed the aviation company was demanding an immediate large deposit to physically fuel the jet, but every single one of her premium platinum credit cards was suddenly declining. She shrieked loudly at Javon, demanding to aggressively know what was currently wrong with the banking accounts. She angrily blamed the strict international banking security protocols. She forcefully ordered Javon to call his private wealth manager immediately and authorize a manual system override. She layered her brilliant performance with carefully calculated gasps and raw, choking sobs. She screamed repeatedly that she could not physically bear being separated from Aaliyah for another agonizing second. She brutally demanded he instantly fix the financial glitch so she could fly directly to Tacoma and safely hold her injured baby. Javon stood completely paralyzed by fear. His exhausted mind simply could not process the unexpected logistical failure. He stammered frantically while desperately trying to soothe her rising temper. He desperately promised to call the bank. He swore he would immediately liquidate a primary portfolio account. He begged her to stay perfectly calm. He was quickly drowning in her flawlessly manufactured chaos, completely blind to the steel trap rapidly closing around him. I did not allow the pathetic performance to continue for another second. I stepped forward and snatched the cellular phone directly from my son's trembling hand. Javon flinched but offered no physical resistance. I held the device in front of my face. I spoke with a deadpan, gravelly cadence devoid of any human empathy. I stated her name coldly. I informed Vanessa that she was not speaking to her husband. I advised her to stop screaming at aviation clerks who did not exist. I told her the offshore wire transfer to St. Lucia was permanently rejected. I explicitly detailed that the primary blind trust had been locked down under an emergency executive fraud protocol. I informed her that every joint account, credit line, and pending mortgage application carrying her name was completely frozen. I told her the money was gone. I let the absolute finality of my words echo through the digital connection. The weaponized weeping abruptly ceased. The line went completely dead silent. The sudden absence of her fake hysteria was incredibly profound. I could hear the faint rhythmic sound of ocean waves and island wind brushing against her phone's microphone. She was standing on the deck of her luxury yacht processing the total destruction of her exit strategy. The poor, stranded mother routine evaporated instantly. Vanessa did not hang up. She did not attempt to maintain the spiritual retreat alibi. The silence stretched for 10 agonizing seconds before she finally spoke. Her voice was no longer a shrill, panicked wail. It transformed into a low, vicious snarl. She dropped the grieving mother act entirely. She realized I was the architect of her sudden financial ruin. She calculated her remaining leverage with terrifying speed. She laughed a dry, hollow sound that chilled the air in the waiting room. She addressed me directly. She mocked my interference. She informed me that freezing the bank accounts was a temporary inconvenience. She revealed her ultimate trump card with absolute arrogance. She stated that when she married Javon, she had systematically secured primary legal control over the household. She happily reminded me that she held the absolute primary medical proxy for Aaliyah. She possessed the sole legal authority to dictate all neurological procedures and life support protocols for my granddaughter. Javon gasped loudly and stumbled backward against the wall. He finally recognized the feral monster hiding behind his wife's voice. Vanessa delivered her ultimatum with surgical cruelty. She ordered me to call my corporate attorneys immediately. She demanded I unlock the offshore trust fund and manually push the $2 million wire transfer through to her St. Lucia accounts. She gave me exactly 1 hour to verify the deposit. Vanessa articulated the consequences with absolute clarity. She stated if the money did not materialize in her offshore account, within 60 minutes she would contact the hospital directly. She promised to execute her right as medical proxy. She threatened to revoke consent for cranial surgery. She promised to authorize the withdrawal of life support. She stated she would let the child suffocate while I watched. She did not wait for my response. The line disconnected with a click. The dial tone echoed in the waiting room. I lowered the phone. Javon slid down the painted wall and crumpled onto the floor, completely broken by the horrific betrayal. His wife had just held a blade to his daughter's throat for $2 million. The game had instantly escalated from financial extortion to premeditated murder. I looked at the dark screen of the phone. Vanessa believed her legal proxy was an impenetrable shield. She thought she could hold a dying child hostage from 2,000 miles away. She was severely mistaken. I reached down and hauled my weeping son back to his feet. We had no time for tears. My granddaughter had less than an hour before her brain damage became fatal. I needed to rip that medical proxy from Vanessa's hands immediately. I hoisted my son upward by his shoulders. Javon felt completely hollowed out. His physical strength had evaporated the moment his wife weaponized his dying child. I guided him to the rigid plastic chair and forced him to sit. I instructed him to breathe steadily. Panic is a luxury we could no longer afford. We were actively engaged in a hostage negotiation, and the hostage was lying unconscious 20 feet away. I paced the sterile perimeter of the waiting room. My mind rapidly processed the tactical requirements necessary to invalidate a legally binding medical proxy. I needed definitive proof of criminal conspiracy. I needed leverage that would force a judge to strip Vanessa of her authority instantly. I could not simply walk into a courtroom with a broken stiletto heel and the recorded confession of a terrified housekeeper. The legal system required an ironclad paper trail to overturn a spousal proxy in a matter of minutes. The heavy automatic doors of the intensive care unit slid open with a mechanical hiss. Dominic Tran walked through the threshold. He moved with the predatory grace of a shark navigating shallow waters. He completely ignored the clinical surroundings and the weeping families nearby. He carried a thick leather portfolio tucked securely under his left arm. He approached me and handed over the heavy file without uttering a single word of greeting. I opened the brass clasp and pulled out the primary dossier. Dominic possessed unparalleled digital hunting skills. He had utilized the brief audio signature of the man shouting in the background of Vanessa's earlier phone call. He matched the vocal print and cross-referenced it with the physical description of the tattooed man from the yacht. He had successfully identified the phantom orchestrating the financial extraction. I stared at the high-resolution photograph clipped to the first page of the heavy dossier. The image displayed a man in his late 30s with styled blonde hair and an expensive custom suit. A distinct geometric tattoo crept just above the collar of his tailored shirt. I read the name printed in bold black ink across the top of the file. The man was Bradley Vance. Dominic began to deliver his briefing in a low, rapid cadence. He informed me that Bradley was not a legitimate financial consultant. He was a highly sophisticated white-collar con artist. Dominic revealed that Bradley was currently the primary target of an active federal investigation regarding massive interstate real estate fraud. He specialized in identifying vulnerable, high-net-worth individuals. He systematically infiltrated their lives through fake corporate identities and elaborate social engineering. He drained their liquid assets through complex offshore shell companies and vanished before the federal authorities could secure indictments. Vanessa was not the mastermind of this operation. She was the inside operative. She was the beautiful Trojan horse Bradley had deployed to infiltrate my son's life and dismantle his empire from within. They had executed this exact maneuver twice before in different states, leaving a trail of bankrupt and devastated husbands. They targeted Javon because of his rapid success and his trusting nature. They knew he possessed substantial equity hidden within his commercial properties. They simply needed the right emotional trigger to force him to liquidate everything blindly. I handed the photograph directly to Javon. My son stared at the image with unblinking bloodshot eyes. A violent tremor rocked his entire body. He recognized the man immediately. He whispered Bradley's name with absolute horror. He confessed that Bradley was the exact private mortgage broker who had been urgently rushing the emergency $2 million loan through the underwriting process tonight. He confessed that Vanessa had personally introduced them 6 months ago at a charity gala. She claimed Bradley was a brilliant independent financier who could expedite complex loans outside traditional banking channels. The sheer scale of their trap became devastatingly clear. Vanessa and Bradley had spent half a year meticulously constructing this flawless snare. They evaluated his business structure and isolated his vulnerabilities. They waited patiently for the perfect opportunity to strike. The tragic fall of Aaliyah provided the ultimate emotional smokescreen. They capitalized on my son's blinding grief to execute the final devastating blow. They planned to cash out the entire coal estate and disappear into the Caribbean while my granddaughter fought for her last breaths. Javon dropped the glossy photograph onto the polished linoleum floor. The final illusion of his perfect marriage shattered completely. He finally understood that his wife never loved him. She only saw him as a temporary financial reservoir waiting to be violently emptied. He clutched his chest and let out a dry, agonizing sob. He realized he had willingly handed the keys to his kingdom to the architects of his daughter's destruction. The betrayal cut deeper than any physical wound. The sudden blare of a medical alarm shattered the heavy silence of the waiting room. The piercing sound originated directly from Aaliyah's private bay. I spun around and sprinted toward the glass partition. A swarm of nurses rushed past me, pushing a heavy crash cart loaded with emergency equipment. The head neurosurgeon burst through the double doors a moment later. His face was grim and completely drained of professional optimism. He marched straight toward us with heavy, urgent steps. He did not offer any gentle bedside manner or comforting platitudes. He delivered the catastrophic news with brutal clinical precision. He announced that Aaliyah had just developed a massive, severe brain bleed. The swelling inside her cranium was expanding at an exponentially fatal rate. The pressure was actively crushing her brainstem and shutting down her vital organs. He stated she required immediate emergency cranial surgery to drill into her skull and relieve the building pressure. He warned us that she would not survive another 30 minutes without the surgical intervention. Javon leapt to his feet and begged the doctor to operate immediately. He screamed at the man to save his little girl. The neurosurgeon shook his head with genuine regret. He stated his hands were completely tied by strict hospital administration protocols. He explained the operation carried incredibly high mortality risks and potential permanent neurological damage. He legally required the signature of the primary medical proxy to authorize the invasive procedure. He looked directly at Javon and demanded Vanessa's immediate presence. He informed us the hospital administration absolutely refused to proceed without her explicit legal consent. Vanessa possessed the ultimate power of life and death over the injured child. The game had just escalated from financial extortion to an execution. My granddaughter was rapidly fading away while the woman who pushed her down the stairs held her hostage from a yacht in the Caribbean. I stared at the neurosurgeon and felt a cold rage settle into my bones. The legal system was moving too slowly. The hospital bureaucracy was inadvertently aiding a ruthless murderer. I had to rip that medical proxy from Vanessa's hands right now. I could not wait for a judge to review a criminal dossier. I knew Dominic could sever her communication lines, but I required her psychological destruction to save the child. I had to force her surrender immediately before my granddaughter died on that table. Javon's knees hit the linoleum floor with a heavy, sickening thud. The crushing weight of the dual betrayals completely overwhelmed his central nervous system. His lungs hitched as he desperately tried to pull oxygen into his chest. He clutched his throat, gasping wildly for air. His face turned a dangerous shade of ash gray. The psychological terror of watching his daughter die while discovering his wife was an active predator triggered a massive panic attack. He slumped sideways against the rigid plastic chairs of the waiting room. I shouted for immediate medical assistance. 2 triage nurses sprinted through the swinging doors and dropped to their knees beside my son. They quickly assessed his spiraling vitals and loaded him onto a portable gurney. The attending physician recognized the immediate danger of a full cardiac event. He ordered a strong intramuscular sedative to stabilize Javon's violently spiking heart rate. I watched them push the gurney down the long white corridor. Javon reached out a trembling hand toward me before the chemical sedative dragged him down into forced unconsciousness. He was completely neutralized. He could not fight for his daughter. The entire burden of Aaliyah's survival now rested entirely upon my shoulders. I stood alone in the sterile hallway. The chaotic noise of the emergency response faded into a dull background hum. My mind sharpened into a singular, lethal focus. The head neurosurgeon stood frozen near the entrance of the intensive care unit. His digital pager buzzed aggressively against his green scrubs. He carried a digital tablet in his right hand. His expression had shifted from clinical urgency to profound professional disgust. He walked directly toward me and stopped a foot away. He did not attempt to soften the blow. He He tapped the glowing screen of his tablet and announced that the administration desk had just received official written correspondence from Vanessa. The message was a legally binding directive sent directly from her verified encrypted email account. She had formally invoked her unassailable legal authority as the primary medical proxy. The surgeon read the short paragraphs aloud. The language was meticulously crafted to sound like the agonizing decision of a heartbroken mother. Vanessa explicitly denied all consent for the emergency cranial surgery. She cited severe quality-of-life concerns regarding the potential permanent neurological damage Aaliyah might suffer if she somehow survived the invasive procedure. She instructed the medical staff to initiate palliative end-of-life care immediately. She demanded they keep the child completely comfortable and allow nature to take its course without surgical interference. She had effectively signed a death warrant disguised as maternal mercy. The hospital administration was entirely paralyzed by the document. The legal department refused to authorize the drill without the proxy signature. The surgeon lowered the tablet. He looked at me with immense frustration. He stated his hands were tied by state medical law. I stared at the digital text glowing on the tablet screen. My mind raced through the cold mathematical logic of a professional confidence artist. Vanessa was a creature built entirely of greed and calculated survival. She did not make emotional decisions. She made financial pivots. Dominic severed her access to the offshore mortgage wire. We had effectively blocked her primary extraction route. She was stranded on a luxury yacht in the Caribbean with frozen credit cards and completely useless shell companies. A normal criminal would have panicked and abandoned the operation. Vanessa simply shifted her focus to the secondary asset. I remembered a specific conversation Javon and I shared 5 years ago. He proudly announced he was building an impenetrable financial fortress for Aaliyah. He purchased a comprehensive whole-life insurance policy for his daughter. The death benefit was precisely $2 million. Vanessa was legally designated as the secondary beneficiary in the event Javon was incapacitated or deceased. The horrifying architecture of her new plan materialized with absolute clarity. Javon was currently incapacitated under heavy medical sedation. If Aaliyah perished tonight, the massive insurance payout would immediately trigger. Vanessa intended to let the little girl suffocate from the expanding brain bleed. She was utilizing the hospital bureaucracy as her personal executioner. She planned to collect the death benefit to replace the funds we locked inside the iron vault. Her sociopathic brilliance was staggering. She was willing to murder an 8-year-old child by bureaucratic proxy to balance her stolen ledger. The rhythmic mechanical beeping from the adjacent intensive care bay suddenly spiked in pitch and frequency. The monitors tracking Aaliyah's fragile vital signs flashed urgent yellow warnings. The immense pressure inside her small skull was rapidly reaching a critical threshold. The head neurosurgeon snapped his attention toward the glass partition. The grim reality of the situation painted his features in harsh shadows. He turned back to me and delivered the ultimate ultimatum. He explicitly stated that the swelling had aggressively bypassed the initial containment protocols. The accumulated blood was actively pressing down onto the delicate brainstem. He informed me with absolute clinical certainty that Aaliyah had less than 60 minutes before the catastrophic damage became entirely irreversible. If he did not physically breach her cranium and drain the fluid within that exact time frame, my granddaughter would suffer total brain death. The window for salvation was closing with terrifying speed. Every single second that ticked past brought the little girl closer to absolute destruction. The surgeon pleaded with me to find a legal loophole. He desperately wanted to save the child, but he was bound by the uncompromising chains of liability and corporate hospital policy. He could not risk his medical license or face a massive civil lawsuit from the proxy. He apologized softly and stepped back into the frantic intensive care unit. I stood perfectly still and absorbed the ticking clock. 60 minutes separated my family from absolute tragedy. The legal system was completely useless in this specific scenario. A standard emergency injunction required a judge to convene a formal hearing. That bureaucratic process demanded days or weeks. I did not possess a single extra hour. I could not negotiate with the sociopath sitting on a yacht in St. Lucia. I could not wait for Javon to wake from his medically induced coma. I had to physically shatter the proxy agreement using overwhelming brute force. I spun around and locked eyes with Dominic Tran. He was standing silently near the visitor elevator, clutching the heavy leather portfolio containing Bradley's extensive criminal history. Dominic understood the gravity of the ticking clock without needing a single word of explanation. He recognized the aggressive shift in my posture. The time for silent observation and defensive blocking had ended. I walked directly toward him. I instructed him to prepare the encrypted financial documents detailing Vanessa's immediate connection to the federal real estate fraud investigation. I commanded him to isolate the audio recording of the attempted bribery involving the terrified housekeeper. We were no longer playing defense. We were going on an aggressive offensive strike against the hospital's corporate leadership. I grabbed Dominic by the shoulder and turned him toward the main administrative wing. We marched straight toward the hospital director's private office, with the singular violent intention of tearing the proxy to shreds. I pushed through the mahogany doors of the hospital administration wing without knocking. Dominic flanked my right side, moving with silent efficiency. The assistant stood up in protest, but I ignored her completely. We marched straight toward the frosted glass walls of the conference room. I knew Hospital Director Richard Sterling worked late to manage the medical facility. I knew he kept an emergency circuit judge available for liability disputes. I kicked the conference room door open. The heavy glass slammed against the rubber doorstop with a violent crack. Director Sterling jumped backward in his leather chair. Judge Arthur Vance was sitting across the polished table nursing black coffee. They both stared at us in absolute shock. I did not offer any formal introductions or apologies for the intrusion. I walked directly to the center of the table. The digital clock indicated we possessed 48 minutes to save my granddaughter from irreversible brain death. Sterling found his voice and demanded security. I slammed my hands flat onto the polished wood and leaned into his space. I informed him that calling security would waste 3 minutes my granddaughter needed to survive. I told him he was harboring a catastrophic liability nightmare that would dismantle his facility. I shifted my focus to Judge Vance. I stated I required an immediate revocation of a primary medical proxy based on criminal fraud and attempted homicide. The gravity of the accusation froze the men in their seats. Judge Vance placed his coffee cup down. He demanded absolute proof to overturn a legally binding spousal proxy without a formal hearing. He warned me that circumventing legal procedure required extraordinary physical evidence. Dominic stepped forward and dropped the thick leather portfolio directly in front of the judge. The heavy file landed with a commanding thud. Dominic did not wait for an invitation. He pulled a compact digital projector from his coat and linked it to his cellular device. He cast the high-resolution image of Bradley Vance directly onto the presentation board. I outlined the entire predatory structure of Vanessa's financial extraction. I detailed how she utilized her stepdaughter's severe trauma as a smokescreen to drain Javon's corporate equity. Dominic distributed the physical banking documents across the table. He presented the frozen trust authorizations and the rejected St. Lucia wire transfer logs. I watched Judge Vance scan the undeniable footprint of a massive offshore embezzlement scheme. He recognized the offshore shell companies immediately. The documentation established a clear motive for Vanessa to want the child dead. Sterling attempted to interject, citing hospital policy regarding unverified financial disputes. I cut him off instantly. I told him financial fraud was merely the prologue to the atrocity. I pulled my secure cellular phone from my pocket. I accessed the encrypted cloud server and brought up the high-definition audio file. I placed the device firmly in the center of the table and maximized the volume. I told them they were about to listen to an eyewitness account of attempted murder. I pressed play. The terrified weeping of Rosa filled the sterile conference room. Her voice trembled with raw, undeniable authenticity. She described Vanessa arguing furiously with Bradley regarding offshore financial transfers. She detailed Aaliyah confronting her stepmother in the hallway. The men at the table stopped breathing as Rosa narrated the horrific climax. She described Vanessa clamping her hand around the child's small arm, planting her designer heel into the carpet, and violently hurling the 50-pound girl down the mahogany staircase. She detailed the sickening sound of the skull fracture and the $20,000 cash bribe to secure her silence. The audio recording ended, leaving a suffocating silence in its wake. Judge Vance physically recoiled from the table. All the color drained completely from his face. He stared at the cellular phone as if it were a physical weapon. The legal hurdles surrounding spousal rights vanished instantly in the face of raw homicidal reality. Vanessa was not a grieving mother making a difficult quality-of-life decision. She was an active predator attempting to execute the primary witness to her crimes. Judge Vance reached into his briefcase with trembling hands. He pulled out a stack of blank emergency injunction forms. He did not ask any further questions. He rapidly filled out the critical judicial mandates. He officially revoked Vanessa's proxy, citing immediate endangerment to a minor. He formally transferred absolute emergency medical authority directly to me. He stamped the documents with his official judicial seal and pushed them across the table. I grabbed the papers and shoved them into Director Sterling's chest. I ordered him to call the surgical floor immediately. Sterling scrambled for the landline. He punched in the intensive care unit extension. He barked the authorization code to the head neurosurgeon. I snatched a pen and aggressively signed my name across the heavy stack of surgical consent forms. We did not waste another second in the administrative wing. We sprinted back down the long corridor toward the intensive care unit. We arrived just as the medical team violently pushed through the double doors. They were already moving Aaliyah's bed toward the operating theater. The neurosurgeon locked eyes with me and gave a single firm nod. They rushed the child down the hallway. We had successfully beaten the clock by exactly 9 minutes. On a yacht anchored in the Caribbean Sea, a digital chime interrupted the wind. Vanessa was pacing the deck, tapping her screen. She expected an email confirming the override of her $2 million wire transfer. She received a completely different notification. The legal alert bypassed her inbox and flashed across her home screen. The black text formally advised her that her medical proxy rights regarding Aaliyah Cole had been judicially terminated. The message cited a severe criminal endangerment injunction. The notification acted like a physical blow to her chest. Her arrogant assumption of absolute control shattered into a million jagged pieces. The frozen accounts were no longer a mere technical glitch. The revoked proxy meant someone had systematically uncovered the depth of her conspiracy. The phantom medical team narrative had collapsed. The life insurance payout was no longer a viable extraction route. The child was moving into surgery, and the witness to her attempted murder might survive to testify. Panic replaced her carefully cultivated arrogance. The yacht was no longer a safe haven. It was a floating cage. If Aaliyah survived the surgery, she would identify her attacker. If police intercepted the housekeeper, bribery charges would generate federal warrants. Vanessa knew she could not vanish without the stolen mortgage funds. Her accounts were empty. She needed liquid capital for a permanent disappearance. She had to intercept the fallout before the investigation launched. She needed to reach Javon and manipulate his mental state one final time. She believed she could control him if she saw him. I stood in the hospital waiting room staring at Dominic's monitor. He had tapped into the International Flight Registry databases. We watched the tracking manifest update in real time. Vanessa utilized a burner card to purchase a ticket. She was abandoning the yacht and boarding a flight. She was flying directly into the jaws of the trap. The flight trajectory confirmed her desperate strategy. She was a cornered predator forced to return to the scene of the crime. She had to eliminate the physical evidence linking her to the fall of Aaliyah before she could attempt to vanish. I knew exactly where she was heading. The broken stiletto heel was her most glaring vulnerability. She needed to retrieve the remaining shoe from her closet and purge any financial documents linking her to Bradley Vance. The Tacoma mansion was her only logical destination. I turned away from the hospital monitors and gave Dominic a final nod. He remained at the medical center to monitor the digital perimeter while I handled the physical confrontation. I stepped out of the hospital and into the freezing rain. I pulled my phone from my pocket and dialed a secure local number. I did not call the standard police dispatch. I called Detective Hector Ramirez. 20 years ago, Ramirez was a rookie investigator drowning in a complex maritime smuggling case. I handed him the exact shipping manifest required to break the syndicate and secure his promotion to detective. He built his entire decorated career on the foundation of my quiet intelligence network. He owed me a profound debt, and tonight, I was calling it in. Ramirez answered on the second ring. I did not offer any pleasantries. I gave him the address of the estate and instructed him to arrive in unmarked vehicles. I told him to park 2 blocks away and wait for my explicit signal before advancing. I outlined the nature of the crime. I informed him he was walking into an active crime scene involving attempted murder and massive financial fraud. Ramirez simply asked how much time we had. I told him the suspect was currently mid-air and would touch down within 3 hours. I hung up and hailed a cab. I needed to secure the battlefield before the enemy arrived. The cab dropped me off at the wrought iron gates of the sprawling Tudor estate. The neighborhood was dead silent under the heavy gray sky. I walked up the long, curving driveway and unlocked the heavy oak front door. The interior of the mansion felt entirely different now. It was no longer a gilded cage. It was a designated kill zone. I immediately located the remaining household staff. 2 junior maids and a groundskeeper were working in the rear wing. I gathered them in the foyer and handed each of them a thick stack of cash. I told them their services were no longer required for the week and ordered them to leave the premises immediately. They recognized the cold authority in my voice and complied without asking a single question. The massive house fell into absolute silence the moment the back door clicked shut. I was completely alone. I retrieved a specialized surveillance kit from my heavy wool coat. The equipment was military-grade and practically invisible. I moved methodically through the primary zones of the estate. I planted a micro camera inside the ornate chandelier hanging directly above the grand staircase landing. I secured a high-definition audio receiver beneath the lip of the mahogany banister. I wired the master bedroom suite. I placed a lens behind the ventilation grate directly facing the expansive walk-in closet. I installed a final camera inside the formal dining room, focusing the lens straight at the custom wall safe where Javon kept his physical documents. Every camera synced flawlessly to the encrypted server on my cellular device. I possessed a perfect panoptic view of the entire playing field. I tested the audio feeds and confirmed the microphones captured even the slightest whisper. The snare was physically set. It simply required the target to step onto the pressure plate. I walked back down the grand staircase and entered the expansive living room. The sheer scale of the architecture was designed to intimidate, but it only amplified the profound emptiness of the home my son had built. I walked over to a high-backed leather armchair positioned perfectly in the corner of the room. The chair offered a commanding view of the foyer, the base of the staircase, and the hallway leading toward the master wing. I sat down and let the heavy leather absorb my weight. I reached out and switched on a single amber lamp resting on the adjacent side table. The low golden light cast long distorted shadows across the expensive Persian rugs and the vaulted ceiling. The rest of the house remained cloaked in absolute darkness. I placed my secure cellular phone on the armrest and opened the surveillance application. The grid of cameras displayed the empty, silent corridors. I settled into the chair and allowed my breathing to slow into a deep, meditative rhythm. Patience is the ultimate weapon of any seasoned investigator. A hasty ambush allows the target an opportunity to manipulate the narrative. A calculated silent wait forces the target to lower their defenses and reveal their true nature. Vanessa would enter this house believing she had successfully outrun the consequences of her actions. She would assume the estate was completely empty. She would assume my son was still paralyzed by grief in the hospital waiting room. She would assume I was merely an old man, easily outmaneuvered by her youthful arrogance. I sat completely motionless in the amber glow and reviewed the tactical geometry of the impending confrontation. Vanessa was incredibly dangerous because she possessed nothing left to lose. She was a cornered animal stripped of her financial exit strategy. She would fight viciously to destroy the evidence. I needed her to gather the remaining stiletto heel. I needed her to attempt to open the wall safe. I needed her to physically interact with the incriminating materials before I revealed my presence. I had to let her fully incriminate herself on the high-definition cameras. I ran my thumb over the cold steel of the pocket knife resting quietly in my right hand. I did not intend to use the blade, but its weight provided a necessary grounding anchor. The digital clock on my phone screen shifted to indicate 2 hours and 40 minutes had passed since she boarded the commercial flight. The window of anticipation was rapidly closing. The heavy silence of the estate was suddenly violated. The harsh sound of rubber tires screeching against the wet asphalt of the long driveway echoed through the property. The noise ripped through the quiet night air, signaling the immediate arrival of the threat. I watched the live feed on my phone screen. A dark luxury town car slammed to a halt directly in front of the grand entrance. The passenger door swung wide open. Vanessa stepped out into the freezing rain. She moved with frantic, uncoordinated speed. She dismissed the driver with a sharp wave of her hand and sprinted toward the porch. I locked the screen of my cellular phone and slipped it into my coat pocket. I gripped the thick armrests of the leather chair tightly. The heavy brass handle of the front door rattled violently. The sharp metallic click of a key turning in the lock signaled the trap was finally springing shut. The heavy oak front door swung inward with a violent shudder. A gust of freezing Tacoma wind blasted through the foyer, driving a sheet of icy rain across the imported marble tiles. Vanessa stumbled over the threshold. She looked absolutely nothing like the pristine socialite who had commanded gala ballrooms just a week ago. Her expensive designer trench coat was completely saturated and clung heavily to her trembling frame. Her perfectly styled hair was matted against her pale cheeks. The frantic transatlantic flight had stripped away her polished veneer. She shoved the heavy door shut and leaned against the solid wood, gasping for breath. The ambient darkness of the sprawling mansion seemed to swallow her whole. She kicked off her damp shoes and took 3 rapid steps toward the grand staircase before her peripheral vision caught the faint amber glow radiating from the corner of the living room. She snapped her head toward the leather armchair. She saw me sitting perfectly still in the shadows. A visceral full-body flinch seized her spine. She gasped loudly and scrambled backward. Her eyes went wide with genuine terror as her brain attempted to process my impossible presence inside her fortress. Her shock lasted exactly 3 seconds. The seasoned predator inside her instantly recognized the absolute necessity of maintaining the illusion. She instinctively defaulted to her manufactured victim persona. The genuine terror in her eyes melted into flawless, weaponized hysteria. She launched herself forward and initiated a shrill, aggressive barrage of accusations. She screamed at the top of her lungs, demanding to know why I was sitting in the dark like a psychotic voyeur. She pointed a trembling finger at my chest and aggressively condemned my monstrous cruelty. She wailed about the agonizing logistical nightmare she had just endured flying commercial from a remote spiritual retreat while her beloved stepdaughter fought for her life. She manufactured heavy, choking sobs that echoed off the vaulted ceiling. She demanded to know the current medical status of her baby. She violently accused me of hijacking her legal rights and deliberately blocking her financial access out of pure, spiteful malice. She shrieked that she had practically crawled back to Tacoma to save her family from my tyrannical interference. Her performance was a masterclass in psychological manipulation. She projected the perfect image of a heartbroken mother desperately fighting a vindictive grandfather. I remained completely motionless in the leather armchair. I did not offer a single word of defense or validation. I allowed her shrill screams to bounce off the walls and die in the heavy silence. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out the small digital remote Dominic had configured. I pressed the central activation button. A concealed high-definition projector bolted beneath the coffee table flared to life. A massive, blinding rectangle of pure white light instantly illuminated the expansive living room wall. Vanessa flinched and shielded her eyes from the sudden glare. The stark white background transitioned into a crystal-clear, high-resolution photograph. The image displayed Vanessa lounging on the teak deck of a luxury yacht anchored in the pristine, turquoise waters of St. Lucia. She was holding a crystal champagne flute and wearing designer sunglasses. The timestamp verified the photo was taken less than 12 hours ago. The visual contradiction to her fabricated spiritual retreat was absolute and undeniable. Her weaponized weeping ceased instantly. Her jaw went completely slack as she stared at the glowing wall. The sheer scale of the projection made the reality inescapable. I stood up slowly from the leather armchair. I maintained unbroken eye contact with the woman who had systematically dismantled my son's life. I reached down to the side table and retrieved the thick, heavy stack of printed financial documents. I stepped out of the amber light and walked directly into the center of the room. I raised the stack of papers and tossed them violently at her feet. The thick manila folder slapped against the hardwood floor with a heavy, authoritative thud. The documents spilled out across the Persian rug. The bold red stamps indicating denied offshore wire transfers glared up at her. The banking logs explicitly detailed her frantic attempts to push $2 million into untraceable Caribbean shell companies. I told her the spiritual retreat alibi was dead. I informed her the blind trust was permanently locked under an emergency federal fraud protocol. I stated that every single financial asset carrying her name had been legally frozen and seized. I told her the money was gone and it was never coming back. I watched her eyes dart frantically between the glowing yacht projection and the scattered financial logs. I began to dissect her entire criminal architecture with cold, surgical precision. I spoke in a low, gravelly cadence devoid of any human empathy. I dropped the name Bradley Vance into the quiet room. Vanessa physically shuddered at the sound of her accomplice's true identity. I explicitly detailed the active federal real estate fraud investigation currently surrounding her fake mortgage broker. I informed her that Dominic had already forwarded her encrypted email communications directly to the federal authorities. I systematically stripped away every single layer of her elaborate deception. I told her I understood the ultimate failsafe she had deployed at the hospital. I articulated her horrific plan to deny Aaliyah the emergency cranial surgery. I stated I knew she intended to murder the child by bureaucratic proxy to collect the $2 million life insurance payout. I let the absolute depravity of her actions echo through the cavernous space. I informed her that Judge Vance had officially revoked her medical authority 3 hours ago. I told her my granddaughter was currently in the operating room recovering from the successful surgery. I explicitly stated that Aaliyah was going to survive to testify against her. The calculated victim persona evaporated completely. The beautiful weeping mother vanished into the cold Tacoma night. The flawless mask shattered to reveal the feral cornered predator hiding underneath. Vanessa did not attempt to deny the accusations. She did not beg for forgiveness or offer another fabricated excuse. Her posture shifted from defensive terror to aggressive lethal tension. Her manicured hands curled into rigid tight fists at her sides. She bared her teeth in a low, vicious snarl that contorted her beautiful features into a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. She realized the financial extraction was a total catastrophic failure. She realized the federal authorities were already mobilizing against her accomplice Bradley. She understood the massive legal implications of my granddaughter surviving the violent fall. The criminal conspiracy was entirely exposed, but she still possessed one final desperate vulnerability. The prosecution required undeniable physical evidence linking her directly to the brutal physical assault on the mahogany staircase. She needed to completely and utterly destroy the bloody, broken stiletto heel she had hastily discarded inside her massive master closet before fleeing the jurisdiction permanently. She snapped her dark gaze away from the glowing digital projection and locked onto the grand staircase. She turned on her heel with sudden explosive speed. She bolted aggressively across the marble foyer and sprinted up the carpeted stairs, desperate to retrieve the vital physical evidence before authorities arrived. Vanessa pushed the heavy mahogany front door open and stumbled into the dark foyer. Her expensive designer trench coat was completely saturated from the freezing winter rain and clung tightly to her shivering frame. Her meticulously styled hair hung in wet, tangled strands across her pale face. She kicked off her damp shoes and took 3 rapid steps before her peripheral vision caught the faint amber glow radiating from the corner of the expansive living room. She snapped her head toward the leather armchair and saw me sitting perfectly still in the shadows. A visceral, full-body flinch seized her spine. She gasped loudly and scrambled backward. Her shock lasted exactly 3 seconds before her predatory instincts engaged. She instantly defaulted to her manufactured victim persona. The genuine terror in her eyes melted into flawless, weaponized hysteria. She launched herself forward and initiated a shrill, aggressive barrage of accusations. She screamed at the top of her lungs, demanding to know why I was sitting in the dark like a psychotic voyeur. She pointed a trembling finger at my chest and aggressively condemned my monstrous cruelty. She wailed about the agonizing logistical nightmare she had just endured flying commercial from a remote spiritual retreat while her beloved stepdaughter fought for her life. She manufactured heavy choking sobs that echoed off the vaulted ceiling. She violently accused me of hijacking her legal rights and deliberately blocking her financial access out of pure, spiteful malice. She shrieked that she had practically crawled back to Tacoma to save her family from my tyrannical interference. I remained completely motionless in the leather armchair. I did not offer a single word of defense or validation. I allowed her shrill screams to bounce off the walls and die in the heavy silence. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out the small digital remote Dominic had configured. I pressed the central activation button. A concealed high-definition projector bolted beneath the coffee table flared to life. A massive, blinding rectangle of white light instantly illuminated the expansive living room wall. Vanessa flinched and shielded her eyes from the sudden glare. The stark white background transitioned into a high-resolution photograph. The image displayed Vanessa lounging on the teak deck of a luxury yacht anchored in the turquoise waters of St. Lucia. She was holding a crystal champagne flute and wearing designer sunglasses. The timestamp verified the photo was taken less than 12 hours ago. Her weaponized weeping ceased instantly. Her jaw went completely slack as she stared at the glowing wall. I stood up slowly from the leather chair. I reached down to the side table and retrieved the stack of printed financial documents. I stepped out of the amber light and walked directly into the center of the room. I raised the stack of papers and tossed them violently at her feet. The thick manila folders slapped against the hardwood floor with a heavy authoritative thud. The documents spilled out across the Persian rug. The bold red stamps indicating denied offshore wire transfers glared up at her. I looked down at the shivering woman and began to dismantle her entire narrative utilizing cold forensic geometry. I explicitly detailed the active federal real estate fraud investigation currently surrounding her fake mortgage broker. I stripped away every layer of her deception. I told her I understood the ultimate failsafe she had deployed at the hospital. I articulated her horrific plan to deny Aaliyah the emergency cranial surgery. I stated I knew she intended to murder the child by bureaucratic proxy to collect the $2 million life insurance payout. I let the depravity of her actions echo through the space. I informed her that Judge Vance had revoked her medical authority 3 hours ago. I stated that Aaliyah was going to survive to testify against her. I informed her that falling down a staircase produces a predictable pattern of blunt force injuries. Aaliyah did not exhibit a forward momentum injury. The lateral bruising on Aaliyah's right shoulder and the fracture on the posterior occipital bone indicated a high-velocity backward propulsion. The physical damage required an application of external kinetic force. I articulated how the structural failure of her shoe proved she had planted her foot aggressively to generate maximum leverage. She needed that physical anchor to violently shove a 50-pound child backward into open space. I told Vanessa the physics did not lie. The bruising, the trajectory, and the shattered shoe formed an irrefutable mathematical equation of attempted murder. The overwhelming weight of the forensic reality snapped the last threads of her psychological restraint. Vanessa realized logic and deception were no longer viable weapons. She abandoned the terrified victim routine completely. Her panic morphed instantly into pure venomous arrogance. She bared her teeth and unleashed a torrent of vicious racist vitriol. She laughed a cold, hollow sound that bounced harshly off the walls. She mocked my forensic analysis and ridiculed my investigative background. She proudly boasted that a wealthy white woman with prominent social standing would never spend a second inside a federal prison based solely on the accusations of an elderly retired black man. She sneered into my face and articulated her perceived untouchability. She stated the judicial system was designed to protect women like her and destroy men like me. She confessed to the assault with absolute impunity, entirely confident her social leverage would act as an impenetrable shield against legal consequences. The hidden high-definition microphones captured her horrific arrogance flawlessly. The live digital recording beamed silently to the encrypted cloud server, guaranteeing her legal destruction in federal court. Vanessa smiled triumphantly, believing she had verbally dominated the confrontation. She believed her venomous monologue had paralyzed my resolve. She snapped her gaze toward the grand staircase. She turned on her heel with explosive speed. She bolted across the marble foyer and sprinted up the carpeted stairs, desperate to retrieve the vital physical evidence. She reached the upper landing and dropped to her knees. The dim light barely illuminated the cream-colored carpet. She dragged her fingers through the fibers with violent urgency. She clawed at the carpet edge near the top step. She swept her hands back and forth across the floorboards, searching blindly in the shadows. Her breathing echoed in the space as a ragged, wet rasp. She crawled toward the baseboards and raked her nails against the polished wood. She checked the narrow gap between the runner and the railing. She found absolutely nothing. The carpet was entirely devoid of the broken stiletto heel she desperately hoped to recover. The absolute absence of the object registered in her mind as a catastrophic failure. She rocked back on her heels and clutched her head. Her timeline was rapidly disintegrating. The sudden violent crash of the heavy front door bursting open stopped her dead in her tracks. The physical impact shook the walls of the grand foyer. The sound of rapid footsteps slapped against the wet marble tiles far below. Bradley Vance stormed into the dark, quiet house. The federal fugitive was soaked from the freezing rain and breathing heavily. He carried a thick metallic briefcase clutched tightly in his right hand. The heavy metallic briefcase slammed against the polished marble floor of the foyer. Bradley Vance stood dripping in the entryway, his expensive custom suit completely ruined by the freezing Tacoma rain. He was entirely unaware of the hidden military-grade cameras capturing his every movement. He was completely blind to my presence, sitting quietly in the amber-lit living room. He shouted her name loudly, his voice echoing with frantic, undisciplined urgency. He demanded to know why the St. Lucia offshore accounts were aggressively bouncing his administrative access codes. He cursed the digital security protocols holding his money hostage. Vanessa scrambled down the grand staircase, her hands empty and her face twisted into a mask of absolute panic. She had failed to retrieve the bloody stiletto heel. Bradley ignored her disheveled state and frantic breathing. He hoisted the metallic briefcase onto the expensive glass coffee table and violently snapped the brass latches open. He pulled out a thick stack of finalized mortgage transfer documents. He aggressively demanded the immediate signature. He stated the underwriting window was rapidly closing and they needed to push the $2 million equity liquidation through the secondary server before the bank flagged the transaction. Vanessa stammered weakly, confessing that her husband was not in the house. I spoke from the deep shadows of the corner armchair. I informed Bradley that my son would not be signing any financial documents tonight, tomorrow, or ever again. Bradley spun around, his eyes darting toward the amber light. He recognized me instantly from the hospital waiting room. He did not retreat. He instinctively puffed out his chest, attempting to use his physical size and aggressive momentum to project dominance over an elderly man. He marched directly toward my leather armchair, brandishing the fraudulent mortgage papers like a physical weapon. He leaned heavily over me, invading my personal space, trying to physically intimidate me into blind compliance. He demanded I contact my son immediately. He ordered me to force him to release the primary trust funds. Bradley threatened to initiate a massive corporate civil lawsuit that would systematically bankrupt the entire Cole estate if the $2 million did not clear the international underwriting protocol by morning. He barked his threats with the practiced confidence of a predator accustomed to terrorizing highly vulnerable targets. I remained perfectly still. I let him expend his false authority and exhaust his rehearsed intimidation tactics. I looked up into his frantic, bloodshot eyes. I raised my right hand into the air and snapped my fingers. The sharp sound cracked like a gunshot through the tense, heavy atmosphere of the living room. Dominic Tran stepped silently out from the deep shadows of the adjoining custom kitchen. He moved with the terrifying, unhurried grace of an apex predator closing in on a trapped kill. Dominic did not carry a weapon. He carried a single, pristine manila envelope. He walked deliberately to the glass coffee table and dropped a certified federal indictment directly on top of the fraudulent mortgage papers. The heavy blue seal of the Federal Bureau of Investigation gleamed maliciously under the overhead lights. Dominic began his dismantling process. He spoke with absolute icy authority. He announced that his own elite commercial brokerage license was entirely fabricated. He detailed the exact offshore shell companies Bradley utilized to funnel stolen money through the Cayman Islands. He recited the specific routing numbers Bradley believed were completely untraceable. Dominic then delivered the fatal blow. He revealed that the Federal Cyber Division had actively monitored their wire fraud operations for the past 3 days. He explained that my lock on the blind trust was not just a defensive maneuver. It was a coordinated stalling tactic designed to hold Bradley in the jurisdiction while the federal warrants were secured and finalized. Dominic laid out the exact mandatory minimum prison sentences for interstate wire fraud conspiracy to commit corporate extortion and flight to avoid federal prosecution. He explicitly stated Bradley was currently looking at 30 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary. The arrogant facade melted off his own face in real time. His aggressive, looming posture collapsed into sheer, unadulterated terror. He looked down at the federal indictment resting on the glass table, and then looked sharply at Vanessa. The survival instinct of a career con artist immediately overrode any lingering loyalty to his romantic partner. He realized he was standing in a rigged room facing decades of brutal incarceration. Bradley backed away from the table, raising his hands defensively into the air. He pointed a trembling finger directly at Vanessa. He began shouting hysterically, his voice cracking under the immense weight of the impending federal charges. He loudly proclaimed that the financial extortion was his only involvement in the operation. He screamed that he never agreed to any form of physical violence against the family. He forcefully stated that the attempted murder of the 8-year-old child was entirely her own idea. He confessed everything without a single moment of hesitation. He told us Vanessa formulated the plan to push Aaliyah down the mahogany staircase to expedite the massive life insurance payout. He stated she desperately wanted the additional $2 million to secure their permanent disappearance into the Caribbean. He offered to turn federal evidence right there in the living room. He begged us to contact the authorities, promising to testify against Vanessa in open federal court in exchange for complete prosecutorial immunity. The criminal alliance shattered into a million jagged pieces on the hardwood floor. Vanessa stood completely paralyzed. The absolute betrayal by her partner echoed through the quiet house. She realized Bradley was actively trading her freedom to secure a selfish plea deal. She realized the digital projection of her yacht, the federal indictment on the table, and the sudden desperate confession meant her pristine, wealthy life was completely and irreversibly over. The invisible walls of the trap were rapidly closing in, threatening to crush her completely. Backed into an inescapable corner, her highly calibrated socialite persona disintegrated. Her survival instincts shifted to a raw, primitive level. She knew the police were likely already en route to the estate. She knew the financial assets were permanently frozen. She needed immediate, untraceable capital to vanish into the underground network. She snapped her head toward the formal dining room located just beyond the main archway. She lunged forward with sudden explosive violence. She shoved Bradley out of her way, sending the taller man stumbling backward into the sharp edge of the glass coffee table. She ignored his loud shouts of protest. Vanessa sprinted toward the massive antique oil painting hanging perfectly centered on the far dining room wall. She was completely desperate to reach the hidden wall safe concealed directly behind the canvas. She knew Javan kept $500,000 in emergency physical cash and a heavy velvet pouch of untraceable diamonds stashed inside that reinforced steel vault. Her manicured fingers clawed frantically at the heavy gilded frame, violently tearing the priceless painting away from the plastered wall to reach the numeric combination dial. She rapidly punched in the 6-digit access code while continuously glancing nervously over her shoulder. She gripped the cold steel handle tightly and pulled. The heavy vault door remained completely immobile. Her frantic fingers slipped against the polished metal. She punched the keypad, entering the 6-digit sequence a second time. The lock flashed a harsh red light. She slammed her fists against the surface, unable to comprehend that Dominic had remotely scrambled the internal security matrix 3 hours ago. The cash and the diamonds were securely entombed inches away from her grasping hands. She let out a guttural scream of absolute fury. She grabbed the handle, anchoring her feet, preparing to heave her weight. I stepped out from the amber light and crossed the threshold into the formal dining room. I moved with deliberate heavy steps and positioned my body directly between Vanessa and the concealed wall safe. I became a physical barrier composed of muscle and righteous anger. She released the handle and spun around. She crashed directly into my chest. She rebounded off my frame and stumbled backward against the long mahogany dining table. Her chest heaved as she struggled to draw oxygen into her panicked lungs. Her eyes darted wildly, searching for an alternative extraction route. She found absolutely nothing useful. I looked down at her and delivered the final absolute truth. I told her the safe was permanently locked. I stated her exit strategy was officially dead. I informed her she would not leave this house with a single dollar. The absolute finality of my words triggered a total psychological collapse. The polished socialite facade completely disintegrated, leaving behind a cornered rabid animal. Consumed by feral desperation, she lunged forward. She raised her right hand high above her shoulder. She channeled every ounce of her panicked adrenaline and bottomless rage into a single violent motion. She swung her arm in a wide, vicious arc. She slapped me directly across the left side of my face with all her physical strength. The sharp, explosive crack of her palm striking my jaw echoed brutally through the empty, cavernous dimensions of the mansion. The sheer force of the impact snapped my head slightly to the right. A hot, stinging sensation instantly flared across my cheekbone. The metallic taste of copper flooded my mouth as my teeth clipped the inside of my lip. I slowly rotated my head back to the center and locked my gaze directly onto her wide, terrified eyes. I did not raise a hand to touch my bruised face. I did not take a single step backward or flinch. I did not offer any physical retaliation whatsoever. I simply stood my ground like an immovable, silent monolith of ultimate reckoning. Vanessa froze completely. Her chest heaved with ragged, shallow breaths. Her right hand hovered in the space between us, trembling violently from the collision. She expected me to strike back. She expected me to shout or stumble. My absolute lack of physical reaction terrified her more than any violent retaliation ever could. She realized her physical violence was completely useless against my resolve. The power dynamic of the room shifted entirely into my possession. I let the stinging pain in my jaw fuel my satisfaction. I smiled. It was a cold, triumphant smile devoid of any warmth or mercy. It was the smile of a hunter watching the steel jaws of a trap sever the leg of a predator. I told her that physical assault was the final required charge. The heavy double doors of the formal dining room suddenly burst wide open. The sudden kinetic violence of the entry shattered the heavy tension of the confrontation. Intense, blinding beams from tactical flashlights instantly flooded the dark room, cutting through the shadows and illuminating the scattered financial documents on the floor. Detective Hector Ramirez stepped into the harsh light. His service weapon was drawn and leveled directly at the center of the room. 3 heavily armed uniformed police officers surged into the dining room immediately behind him, forming an impenetrable tactical wall. Their presence instantly neutralized the room's remaining oxygen. Ramirez kept his weapon steady and his eyes locked entirely on the suspects. He did not issue a standard police greeting. He spoke with the commanding authority of a veteran law enforcement officer executing a flawless ambush. He announced that he had maintained a secure position 2 blocks away for the past hour. He stated his tactical team had actively monitored the live audio feed transmitting from the hidden microphones I installed throughout the estate. Ramirez explicitly detailed the evidence they had just captured on the federal recording. He informed Vanessa and Bradley that they had just documented a full criminal confession regarding a massive interstate wire fraud conspiracy. He confirmed they captured Bradley explicitly detailing the premeditated plan to murder an 8-year-old child. He confirmed they captured Vanessa acknowledging the brutal assault on the staircase. He stated they possessed undeniable audio evidence of her racist arrogance and her violent physical strike against my face. He declared it. Bradley Vance recognized the absolute finality of the situation, the realization that he was surrounded by armed police officers carrying a federal indictment triggered a desperate animalistic urge to flee. He ignored the lethal weapons pointed directly at his chest. He spun around and lunged blindly toward the massive bay windows overlooking the rear gardens. He intended to shatter the glass and disappear into the night. He never made it past the mahogany dining table. 2 uniformed officers launched themselves forward with explosive speed. They tackled Bradley at the waist. The combined weight of the officers drove the con artist violently into the hardwood floor. The impact knocked the wind entirely out of his lungs. Bradley gasped and thrashed against the polished wood. The officers pinned his arms behind his back with ruthless professional efficiency. The sharp metallic click of steel handcuffs ratcheting shut echoed sharply in the room. Bradley pressed his face against the floor and began to sob uncontrollably. The arrogant phantom was reduced to a weeping criminal. Detective Ramirez holstered his weapon and walked directly toward Vanessa. She remained pinned against the dining table, paralyzed by the rapid escalation of force. Ramirez grabbed her wrists and aggressively twisted them behind her back. She let out a sharp cry of pain as he forced the steel handcuffs onto her wrists. He clamped the metal tightly into her flesh, locking the mechanisms with absolute finality. Ramirez recited her rights in a cold monotone, completely ignoring her sudden, frantic pleas for mercy. He grabbed her firmly by the upper arm and physically hauled her away from the safe. The realization of total destruction finally registered in her mind. Vanessa threw her head back and began to scream wildly. Her shrill, panicked shrieks echoed off the marble tiles as Ramirez dragged her out of the dining room. She thrashed against his iron grip, kicking the floorboards. She demanded private attorneys and wailed about her stolen wealth. The officers marched her aggressively across the foyer and shoved her through the open front door. The freezing Tacoma rain instantly washed over her frantic face. The flashing lights of the police cruisers illuminated the cold night air, signaling the absolute termination of her reign. She gripped the cold steel handle tightly and pulled. The heavy vault door remained completely immobile. Her frantic fingers slipped against the polished metal. She punched the keypad, entering the 6-digit sequence a second time. The lock flashed a harsh red light. She slammed her fists against the surface, unable to comprehend that Dominic had remotely scrambled the internal security matrix 3 hours ago. The cash and the diamonds were securely entombed inches away from her grasping hands. She let out a guttural scream of absolute fury. She grabbed the handle, anchoring her feet, preparing to heave her weight. I stepped out from the amber light and crossed the threshold into the formal dining room. I moved with deliberate, heavy steps and positioned my body directly between Vanessa and the concealed wall safe. I became a physical barrier composed of muscle and righteous anger. She released the handle and spun around. She crashed directly into my chest. She rebounded off my frame and stumbled backward against the long mahogany dining table. Her chest heaved as she struggled to draw oxygen into her panicked lungs. Her eyes darted wildly, searching for an alternative extraction route. She found absolutely nothing useful. I looked down at her and delivered the final absolute truth. I told her the safe was permanently locked. I stated her exit strategy was officially dead. I informed her she would not leave this house with a single dollar. The absolute finality of my words triggered a total psychological collapse. The polished socialite facade completely disintegrated, leaving behind a cornered, rabid animal. Consumed by feral desperation, she lunged forward. She raised her right hand high above her shoulder. She channeled every ounce of her panicked adrenaline and bottomless rage into a single violent motion. She swung her arm in a wide, vicious arc. She slapped me directly across the left side of my face with all her physical strength. The sharp, explosive crack of her palm striking my jaw echoed brutally through the empty, cavernous dimensions of the mansion. The sheer force of the impact snapped my head slightly to the right. A hot, stinging sensation instantly flared across my cheekbone. The metallic taste of copper flooded my mouth as my teeth clipped the inside of my lip. I slowly rotated my head back to the center and locked my gaze directly onto her wide, terrified eyes. I did not raise a hand to touch my bruised face. I did not take a single step backward or flinch. I did not offer any physical retaliation whatsoever. I simply stood my ground like an immovable, silent monolith of ultimate reckoning. Vanessa froze completely. Her chest heaved with ragged, shallow breaths. Her right hand hovered in the space between us, trembling violently from the collision. She expected me to strike back. She expected me to shout or stumble. My absolute lack of physical reaction terrified her more than any violent retaliation ever could. She realized her physical violence was completely useless against my resolve. The power dynamic of the room shifted entirely into my possession. I let the stinging pain in my jaw fuel my satisfaction. I smiled. It was a cold, triumphant smile devoid of any warmth or mercy. It was the smile of a hunter watching the steel jaws of a trap sever the leg of a predator. I told her that physical assault was the final required charge. The heavy double doors of the formal dining room suddenly burst wide open. The sudden kinetic violence of the entry shattered the heavy tension of the confrontation. Intense blinding beams from tactical flashlights instantly flooded the dark room, cutting through the shadows and illuminating the scattered financial documents on the floor. Detective Hector Ramirez stepped into the harsh light. His service weapon was drawn and leveled directly at the center of the room. 3 heavily armed, uniformed police officers surged into the dining room immediately behind him, forming an impenetrable tactical wall. Their presence instantly neutralized the room's remaining oxygen. Ramirez kept his weapon steady, and his eyes locked entirely on the suspects. He did not issue a standard police greeting. He spoke with the commanding authority of a veteran law enforcement officer executing a flawless ambush. He announced that he had maintained a secure position 2 blocks away for the past hour. He stated his tactical team had actively monitored the live audio feed transmitting from the hidden microphones I installed throughout the estate. Ramirez explicitly detailed the evidence they had just captured on the federal recording. He informed Vanessa and Bradley that they had just documented a full criminal confession regarding a massive interstate wire fraud conspiracy. He confirmed they captured Bradley explicitly detailing the premeditated plan to murder an 8-year-old child. He confirmed they captured Vanessa acknowledging the brutal assault on the staircase. He stated they possessed undeniable audio evidence of her racist arrogance and her violent physical strike against my face. He declared it. Bradley Vance recognized the absolute finality of the situation. The realization that he was surrounded by armed police officers carrying a federal indictment triggered a desperate, animalistic urge to flee. He ignored the lethal weapons pointed directly at his chest. He spun around and lunged blindly toward the massive bay windows overlooking the rear gardens. He intended to shatter the glass and disappear into the night. He never made it past the mahogany dining table. 2 uniformed officers launched themselves forward with explosive speed. They tackled Bradley at the waist. The combined weight of the officers drove the con artist violently into the hardwood floor. The impact knocked the wind entirely out of his lungs. Bradley gasped and thrashed against the polished wood. The officers pinned his arms behind his back with ruthless professional efficiency. The sharp metallic click of steel handcuffs ratcheting shut echoed sharply in the room. Bradley pressed his face against the floor and began to sob uncontrollably. The arrogant phantom was reduced to a weeping criminal. Detective Ramirez holstered his weapon and walked directly toward Vanessa. She remained pinned against the dining table, paralyzed by the rapid escalation of force. Ramirez grabbed her wrists and aggressively twisted them behind her back. She let out a sharp cry of pain as he forced the steel handcuffs onto her wrists. He clamped the metal tightly into her flesh, locking the mechanisms with absolute finality. Ramirez recited her rights in a cold monotone, completely ignoring her sudden frantic pleas for mercy. He grabbed her firmly by the upper arm and physically hauled her away from the safe. The realization of total destruction finally registered in her mind. Vanessa threw her head back and began to scream wildly. Her shrill, panicked shrieks echoed off the marble tiles as Ramirez dragged her out of the dining room. She thrashed against his iron grip, kicking the floorboards. She demanded private attorneys and wailed about her stolen wealth. The officers marched her aggressively across the foyer and shoved her through the open front door. The freezing Tacoma rain instantly washed over her frantic face. The flashing lights of the police cruisers illuminated the cold night air, signaling the absolute termination of her reign. The cold fluorescent lights of the Tacoma Police Precinct interrogation room cast harsh, sterile shadows across the scuffed metal table. Vanessa sat handcuffed to the heavy steel ring bolted directly to the center of the surface. Her saturated designer trench coat had been forcefully confiscated during booking. She shivered violently in her damp silk blouse. Her expensive makeup was smeared across her pale cheeks, forming dark, jagged lines of ruined vanity. 2 homicide detectives stood near the heavy, reinforced door, observing her frantic behavior. She did not remain silent in the austere room. She immediately launched into a desperate, calculated performance designed to manipulate the investigators. She weaponized her tears and demanded a high-profile defense attorney immediately. She aggressively pivoted her narrative to portray herself as a terrified victim of intense domestic coercion. She claimed Bradley Vance was a violent, manipulative monster who had forced her to participate in the financial extraction under the constant threat of severe physical harm. She wailed that she possessed absolutely no knowledge of his fraudulent mortgage enterprise. She sobbed heavily into her restricted hands, stating she was merely a desperate mother trying to protect her stepdaughter from Bradley's ruthless extortion tactics. Her lies were fluid and rehearsed. She knew her only remaining tactical option was to completely betray her desperate accomplice and suddenly secure prosecutorial immunity before Bradley could finalize his own pending plea deal with the aggressive federal authorities. The heavy steel door swung open with a dull mechanical groan. The two detectives stepped back and quietly exited the room. I walked through the threshold and let the heavy door click shut behind me. The harsh metallic echo instantly silenced her manufactured weeping. I did not sit down across from her. I walked slowly to the opposite side of the metal table and looked down at the woman who had nearly murdered my only granddaughter. I carried a single unmarked manila folder. I dropped it onto the table. I did not raise my voice or offer any emotional reaction to her pathetic theatrical performance. I opened the folder and slid two specific items across the cold steel surface directly into her line of sight. The first item was a sworn written affidavit signed by Rosa, the head housekeeper. The second item was a clear plastic evidence bag containing a thick stack of $100 bills. Vanessa stared at the physical currency and the rigid signature. I informed her that Rosa possessed a fierce conscience that could not be permanently bought. I stated the housekeeper had come to me days ago and surrendered the bribe money Vanessa had paid her to abandon the estate on the afternoon of the assault. I explained that Rosa had provided a comprehensive sworn statement detailing exactly how Vanessa had meticulously cleared the sprawling mansion of all household staff to ensure there were absolutely no witnesses when Aaliyah fell. The sudden introduction of the loyal housekeeper completely derailed her abused wife narrative. Vanessa opened her mouth to formulate a new desperate alibi, but I did not allow her to speak. I systematically laid out the irrefutable chain of evidence that guaranteed her permanent incarceration. I pulled a forensic pathology report from the folder and placed it beside the bribe money. I detailed the exact physics of the blunt force trauma Aaliyah sustained. I explained how the lateral bruising and the posterior skull fracture mathematically proved the young child was violently shoved backward with immense kinetic force. I pulled the printed banking logs from the folder and arrayed them across the table. I highlighted the exact timestamps showing her frantic attempts to wire $2 million to the Cayman Islands while her stepdaughter was bleeding in an ambulance. I pointed to the red denial stamps proving her complete financial failure. I then withdrew a small digital audio transcript. I informed her that the hidden microphones in the Tacoma mansion had captured every single syllable of her feral, racist arrogance. I told her the federal authorities possessed a crystal-clear recording of her explicitly confessing to the attempted murder and boasting that her wealthy social status made her immune to the law. I stated they also possessed the audio of her violently striking my face. I looked directly into her wide, panicked eyes and delivered the absolute finality of her bleak situation. I told her the physical forensics, the financial logs, the bribed witness, and her own recorded confession formed an inescapable concrete vault. I informed her she had absolutely no leverage, no money, and zero chance of ever breathing free air again. The mathematical certainty of her total destruction finally penetrated her aggressive delusions. The realization that her pristine, wealthy existence was permanently over struck her with the massive force of a physical blow. The manufactured victim persona completely evaporated. She realized there was no charm, no lie, and no expensive lawyer capable of breaking the steel chain of evidence I had painstakingly forged. The absolute loss of control pushed her instantly beyond the limits of human sanity. She erupted in pure, unadulterated feral rage. She lunged forward aggressively against the metal table. The steel handcuff chain snapped tight, biting violently into her bruised wrists. She ignored the tearing pain and slammed her clenched fists repeatedly against the metal surface. The heavy impacts echoed sharply in the small concrete room. She bared her teeth and shrieked like a trapped rabid animal. She cursed my name with vicious, venomous hatred. She cursed Javon for bringing my bloodline into her life. She screamed horrific, vile obscenities about Aaliyah, expressing profound, raging fury that the innocent child had survived the violent fall to ruin her perfect future. Her face twisted into an ugly, unrecognizable mask of pure evil. The elegant Tacoma socialite was entirely dead, leaving only a screaming monster chained to a metal table. I watched her tear her own vocal cords apart for exactly 10 seconds. I did not absorb a single ounce of her toxic venom. Her unhinged rage meant absolutely nothing to me anymore. She was a completely neutralized threat. I turned my back on the screaming woman and walked toward the reinforced steel door. I did not look back as I pushed the heavy handle and stepped out into the quiet precinct hallway. The heavy door clicked shut, severing the sound of her feral shrieks. I walked past the silent detectives and exited the building through the main double doors. I stepped out into the freezing winter air. The violent rainstorm had finally broken. A cold, pale light pierced the heavy gray clouds on the eastern horizon. Dawn was breaking over the waking city of Tacoma. I took a deep breath of the sharp, clean air, letting the freezing temperature clear the heavy exhaustion from my lungs. The tactical operation was officially over. The predator had been permanently caged. I reached into my dark coat pocket to retrieve my car keys. My cellular phone vibrated sharply against my palm. I pulled the small device out and looked at the bright illuminated screen. The caller identification displayed the main desk of the pediatric intensive care unit. I swiped the green icon and raised the speaker to my ear. The voice on the other end of the cellular line was clipped and entirely professional. The pediatric intensive care unit charge nurse informed me my son was awake and highly agitated. She stated he was aggressively demanding answers and pulling at his intravenous lines. I confirmed I was exactly 5 minutes away and ended the call. I slipped the phone into my heavy wool coat and walked directly toward my parked vehicle. The cold Tacoma dawn washed the city in pale gray light, but the impending sunrise offered no warmth. The tactical execution was complete, but the emotional battlefield remained unresolved. I drove through the empty morning streets with mechanical precision. I parked in the garage and navigated the sterile white corridors. The heavy scent of antiseptic and floor wax filled my lungs. I bypassed the main waiting area and walked straight through the double security doors of the pediatric wing. The rhythmic beeping of cardiac monitors and the soft hum of medical ventilators created a steady mechanical heartbeat. I reached room 412. I pushed the heavy wooden door open and stepped inside. Javon looked terrible. He was propped up against the stiff hospital pillows with dark, heavy bags bruising the fragile skin beneath his bloodshot eyes. The physical exhaustion of the past 24 hours had drained all the color from his face. He was thrashing against the tangled web of monitor wires taped securely to his chest. The moment the heavy door clicked shut, he snapped his head toward me. His eyes were wild and completely unfocused. He did not ask about Aaliyah. He did not ask about the surgical outcome or her dangerous cranial swelling. He immediately demanded to know the exact whereabouts of his wife. His voice was hoarse and fractured. He frantically insisted Vanessa had been trying to return from her spiritual retreat. He claimed she called him from the international airport and promised to be by his side. He aggressively accused the hospital staff of deliberately keeping her away from him. He gripped the thin white blanket with white-knuckled intensity and demanded I bring her to the room immediately. He was a man bleeding out from a mortal wound, wanting to embrace the blade that cut him. I looked at my only son. I saw the fragile dependency Vanessa had cultivated and weaponized for years. I knew I had to completely destroy his manufactured reality. I walked across the sterile linoleum floor and sat heavily in the rigid plastic chair beside his bed. I did not offer him a reassuring smile or a gentle lie. I maintained a posture of absolute unyielding stone. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out the encrypted digital tablet Dominic had provided. I rested the cold glass screen on my knee. Javon stopped his frantic thrashing and stared at the device. He recognized the heavy gravity in my silence. He demanded to know what I was holding. I told him I possessed the absolute truth. I told him the healing process required a complete surgical extraction of the infection. I raised the tablet and swiped my thumb across the screen. I opened the high-resolution photograph Dominic had intercepted. I turned the screen directly toward Javon. I showed him the vivid image of Vanessa lounging on the pristine teak deck of the Caribbean yacht. I pointed out the crystal champagne flute in her hand and the bright tropical sun reflecting off her designer sunglasses. I articulated the timestamp embedded in the corner of the image. I informed my son that his wife was not on a spiritual retreat. I stated she was actively celebrating her anticipated financial windfall while his daughter was bleeding on an emergency room table. Javon stared at the glowing screen. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound emerged. He weakly shook his head and attempted to dismiss the photograph as a digital fabrication. I did not allow him to retreat into his comfortable delusions. I swiped the screen a second time and opened the intercepted audio file. I pressed play and maximized the volume. The recording filled the quiet hospital room. The audio captured every single vicious syllable Vanessa had screamed in the Tacoma mansion just an hour ago. Javon listened to his wife mock my forensic analysis. He listened to her racist vitriol. He heard her explicitly confess to violently shoving Aaliyah down the mahogany staircase. The absolute worst moment arrived when her recorded voice described his daughter as a pathetic, disposable obstacle. She boasted loudly about the $2 million life insurance policy. She laughed about her brilliant strategy to legally deny the emergency cranial surgery. She explicitly articulated her calculated plan to let Aaliyah die to secure their total financial freedom. I watched the brutal recording completely dismantle my son's entire universe. Every single spoken word was a fatal blow to his manufactured marriage. The audio file ended. The heavy silence that followed was suffocating. Javon stared blankly at the pale wall opposite his bed. The physical transformation was horrifying to witness. The defensive posture completely collapsed. His broad shoulders slumped forward and his chest caved inward. The brutal realization hit him with the destructive force of a freight train. The woman he loved had manipulated him, isolated him, and actively attempted to murder his only child for offshore cash. His blind devotion had provided her with the perfect weapon. He had voluntarily handed her the medical proxy that almost ended Aaliyah's life. He began to hyperventilate. Short, ragged gasps tore through his throat. He clutched his hands tightly into his hair and let out a long, agonizing scream of pure, unadulterated torment. The sound ripped through the quiet hospital wing. It was the sound of a man's soul tearing entirely in half. He thrashed against the mattress, kicking the sterile blankets away. He wept with a feral, violent intensity. He sobbed out his daughter's name over and over again, cursing his own unforgivable blindness. I stood up from the plastic chair. I leaned over the hospital bed and wrapped my arms tightly around his shaking shoulders. I pulled my weeping son against my chest, holding him with all my physical strength. I anchored him to reality as his entire world burned to ashes. I let him weep until his vocal cords bled. We remained locked together in the sterile room for a long time. His agonizing sobs slowly reduced to exhausted gasps. The rhythmic beeping of the cardiac monitor matched his slowing pulse. I kept my hand firmly on his shoulder, providing a silent, unyielding pillar of support. The heavy wooden door suddenly swung open. The sharp squeak of the metal hinges broke the emotional silence. I turned my head toward the entrance. The head pediatric neurosurgeon stepped into the room. He did not carry his usual medical clipboard. He wore blue surgical scrubs. The fabric was darkly stained. His face was pale, and the deep lines around his eyes spoke of immense exhaustion. He looked directly at me and then shifted his dark gaze to my son. The surgeon swallowed hard. He instructed both of us to step outside into the hallway immediately. The heavy wooden door shut firmly behind us, sealing the sudden explosion of medical chaos inside the room. I gripped Javon by the shoulder and physically steered him toward the large observation window embedded in the corridor wall. The soundproof glass offered a terrifying silent movie of absolute desperation. Aaliyah was thrashing violently against the crisp white sheets. A sudden post-operative seizure had hijacked her fragile neurological system. The head surgeon who had just dismissed us barked rapid orders to a swarm of nurses and critical care specialists. They descended upon the small bed like a synchronized military unit. Intravenous lines were rapidly injected with heavy anticonvulsant medications. The harsh mechanical alarms of the life support monitors pierced the thick glass barrier, warning of crashing vitals and escalating intracranial pressure. Javon pressed his hands flat against the cold pane. His breath fogged the glass. He watched the frantic resuscitation efforts with wide, unblinking eyes. He looked entirely hollowed out. The devastating revelation of his wife's betrayal had shattered his spirit, but this immediate mortal threat to his daughter threatened to stop his heart completely. I stood shoulder to shoulder with my son in the sterile hallway. I felt the profound, crushing weight of absolute helplessness. I had spent the last 48 hours deploying immense resources. I had utilized high-level surveillance networks and dismantled a sophisticated criminal syndicate. I had seized millions of dollars in offshore assets and orchestrated the brutal tactical takedown of 2 federal fugitives. I had won the war. I had secured the absolute destruction of the enemies who attacked my bloodline. None of it mattered. The offshore accounts, the recovered real estate, the federal indictments, and the frozen trust funds possessed absolutely zero value in this sterile corridor. I could not buy a single steady heartbeat for my granddaughter. I could not negotiate a ceasefire with the swelling in her bruised brain. All the tactical leverage in the world was entirely useless against the raw, unforgiving reality of human mortality. I watched the medical team fight to stabilize the violent electrical storm ravaging Aaliyah's mind. The stark contrast between my absolute control over the criminal battlefield and my total impotence in this medical arena was a bitter, agonizing pill. The first hour passed in a blur of frantic medical interventions. The seizure subsided under the heavy chemical barrage, but her vital signs plunged into a terrifyingly erratic rhythm. The green lines on the digital monitors spiked and crashed wildly. Javon did not move away from the glass. He stood completely rigid, tracking every single fluctuation on the life support machinery. I maintained my position beside him, acting as a silent, unyielding anchor. We did not speak. Words were entirely insufficient for the magnitude of the terror gripping our throats. The bright fluorescent lights overhead buzzed with a low mechanical hum that scraped against my exhausted nerves. The hospital staff rushed past us in the corridor carrying blood bags and emergency surgical trays. The heavy scent of iodine and sterilized linen saturated the recycled air. The second hour brought a suffocating, agonizing plateau. The violent physical thrashing had ceased, but Aaliyah remained trapped in a deep, medically induced precipice. The head surgeon stood over her, adjusting the ventilator settings with precise, calculating movements. He monitored the cranial pressure gauge with intense, unwavering focus. Every slight fluctuation in the numbers dictated a new adjustment of the chemical drip. Javon leaned his forehead against the cold glass. His broad shoulders trembled with silent, suppressed sobs. He was silently begging the universe to spare his innocent child. He was offering his own life in exchange for hers. I placed my right hand firmly on the center of his back. I transferred every ounce of my remaining strength into his trembling frame. I silently demanded the universe reject his terrible bargain and return the child to the light. The third hour stretched into an eternity of suspended animation. The physical exhaustion in my bones felt like liquid lead. The adrenaline that had sustained my tactical execution was rapidly burning away, leaving behind a profound, heavy fatigue. I watched the digital clock mounted above the nurse's station tick forward with agonizing slowness. Every passing minute felt like a physical weight pressing down on my chest. I focused entirely on the rhythmic expansion and contraction of Aaliyah's small chest. The mechanical ventilator forced oxygen into her lungs, maintaining the fragile tether between life and death. The medical team continued their silent, synchronized ballet around the bed, adjusting monitors and checking intravenous lines. The sheer dedication of the exhausted professionals fighting for my granddaughter's life demanded absolute respect. Suddenly, the chaotic, erratic beeping bleeding through the thick glass began to change. The sharp, terrifying alarms that had dominated the past 3 hours gradually subsided. The frantic digital spikes on the primary cardiac monitor smoothed out. The chaotic, jagged lines transitioned into a beautiful, rhythmic sequence. The tone of the machinery shifted from a desperate warning to a steady, reassuring pulse. The heavy, suffocating tension inside the room broke instantly. The nurses stepped back from the bed, exhaling long, audible breaths of pure relief. The head surgeon lowered his hands from the cranial monitor and stepped back. He looked at the stabilizing vital signs and closed his eyes for a fraction of a second. He turned his exhausted face toward the observation window. He met my gaze through the glass and gave a slow, deliberate nod. The universal signal of salvation washed over the corridor. Javon let out a choked, ragged gasp. His knees buckled slightly. I gripped his arm tightly, keeping him upright. The heavy wooden door clicked open. A junior nurse stepped out and gently instructed us to return to the room. We walked back into the intensive care unit. The atmosphere was completely transformed. The frantic military energy had been replaced by a quiet, reverent calm. The harsh overhead lights had been dimmed. The steady, rhythmic thumping of the heart monitor provided a beautiful, comforting soundtrack. Javon walked directly to the side of the hospital bed. He dropped heavily into the plastic chair. He reached out with trembling hands and gently cupped his daughter's small, fragile fingers. Aaliyah's eyes remained closed. Her face was pale beneath the heavy white bandages wrapping her skull. Javon leaned forward and rested his forehead against the edge of the mattress. He whispered her name over and over again in a broken, gravelly voice. He poured all his shattered love and desperate relief into the quiet space. He apologized for his blindness. He promised to protect her forever. He wept openly without any reservation or shame. Suddenly, a microscopic movement broke the stillness. Aaliyah's small fingers twitched against the white hospital sheets. She weakly curled her hand inward and applied a faint, fragile squeeze to her father's thumb. It was a minuscule physical gesture, but it carried the gravitational weight of a collapsing star. It was the undeniable pulse of life returning to the surface. Javon gasped and raised his head. He stared at their joined hands with absolute reverent awe. A fresh wave of tears cascaded down his exhausted face. He kissed her small knuckles repeatedly. The emotional core of the family was finally secure. The infection had been permanently excised, and the healing process had officially begun. I stood at the foot of the bed and watched my son embrace his miraculous salvation. I allowed the profound relief to wash through my tired veins for exactly 30 seconds. I raised my left arm and looked down at my steel wristwatch. The glowing digital dial confirmed the exact passage of time. Exactly 48 hours had elapsed since my commercial flight touched down on the Seattle tarmac. 2 days of relentless, calculated warfare had completely dismantled Vanessa's criminal empire. The physical threat was neutralized. The financial assets were secured. The medical crisis was stabilizing. I slowly reached up and fastened the center button of my heavy wool suit jacket. I adjusted my collar and smoothed the lapels. The personal, emotional battlefield was now firmly in my son's capable hands. The final phase of my operation required a different arena. It was time to leave the sanctuary of the hospital and walk directly into the harsh, unforgiving light of the federal judicial system. It was time for the final strike. I stepped through the hospital double doors and walked into the biting Pacific Northwest morning. The freezing air hit my face but felt entirely invigorating. I had spent the last 48 hours fighting a war in the shadows, and now the battlefield transitioned to the fluorescent illumination of the federal courthouse. I drove through the gray streets of Tacoma with singular purpose. Detective Ramirez had pushed the arraignment forward with ruthless efficiency. I parked in the underground structure and rode the elevator to the 4th floor. The polished marble corridors smelled of floor wax and stale coffee. I walked past milling attorneys until I reached courtroom block B. I pushed the oak doors open and stepped into the gallery. The room was sparsely populated but charged with potent electrical tension. Javon remained at the hospital, sitting vigil beside his recovering daughter. He entrusted me with the duty of facing the woman who systematically dismantled his life. I took a seat directly behind the prosecution table and waited for the final reckoning to commence. The heavy wooden door adjacent to the judge's bench clicked open. A burly armed bailiff stepped through the threshold holding a thick steel chain. Vanessa followed immediately behind him. The visual transformation was absolutely staggering. The immaculate Tacoma socialite who had commanded gala ballrooms and orchestrated multi-million-dollar financial extractions was completely dead. She wore a stark, oversized neon orange prison jumpsuit that hung limply off her shoulders. The coarse industrial fabric offered a brutal contrast to the imported silks she had previously utilized as armor. Her perfectly manicured hands were shackled tightly to a heavy leather belt cinched around her waist. She shuffled forward with a defeated, dragging gait. She was completely barefoot. Her bare toes curled instinctively against the freezing, polished linoleum floor of the courtroom. The physical degradation was total and undeniable. Her hair hung in greasy, tangled strands across her pale, unwashed face. The residual smears of expensive cosmetics had been scrubbed away, leaving behind a gaunt, terrified mask of pure desperation. She stepped up to the defendant's podium and gripped the wooden edge with restricted hands. She turned her head and scanned the gallery. Her bloodshot eyes locked directly onto mine. She did not project her feral, racist arrogance anymore. She did not attempt to manufacture her abused wife persona. She looked at me with a pathetic, shattered, pleading gaze. She was silently begging for an ounce of mercy she had completely denied my granddaughter. I did not break eye contact. I did not offer a single fraction of empathy. I stared at her with the cold, unyielding judgment of a man who successfully neutralized a rabid predator. The bailiff barked a sharp command instructing the gallery to rise. Judge Miller strode to the bench and sat down, heavily adjusting his reading glasses. He slammed his wooden gavel against the sounding block, bringing the chaotic murmurs to an absolute halt. He picked up the manila folder containing the federal indictment and read the charges aloud. The list of criminal offenses echoed through the cavernous courtroom like a relentless tolling bell: conspiracy to commit interstate wire fraud, forgery of federal documents, grand larceny, aggravated assault with a deadly weapon, attempted murder in the first degree. Vanessa physically shuddered at the recitation of every single charge. Her public defender stood up and meekly requested reasonable bail. He cited her lack of prior criminal history and prominent social standing within the Tacoma community. He argued she was not a flight risk despite the undeniable evidence of her offshore accounts and intercepted communications. The federal prosecutor immediately objected. She pointed to the extreme violence of the assault and the calculated nature of the financial extraction. Judge Miller raised his hand and silenced the arguing attorneys. He looked across the courtroom at the prosecution table. He announced that before rendering his final decision regarding bail, he would permit a victim impact statement from the family. The prosecutor turned and nodded respectfully in my direction. I stood up from the wooden bench and buttoned my suit jacket. I walked past the swinging wooden gate and stepped confidently into the center aisle. I did not look at the judge or the trembling public defender. I turned my body and locked my gaze entirely on the barefoot woman shivering behind the defendant's podium. I spoke in a clear, resonant baritone that carried to every single corner of the quiet courtroom. I stated that Vanessa had intentionally invaded a grieving family under the false pretense of love and support. I detailed how she systematically manipulated my son, utilizing his vulnerability as a weapon to secure complete access to his financial architecture. I told the court how she had isolated an innocent child, feeding her a daily diet of psychological cruelty while actively plotting to steal her inheritance. I described the horrific calculation required to physically shove a 50-pound girl down a flight of mahogany stairs for a $2 million life insurance payout. Vanessa squeezed her eyes shut and dropped her head toward her chained wrists. I refused to let her hide. I raised my voice slightly, forcing her to absorb every syllable of her own destruction. I explicitly contrasted her priorities. I told the court she had actively chosen offshore accounts over maternal responsibility. I stated she had completely thrown away a devoted husband and a beautiful family for the temporary illusion of a luxury yacht in the Caribbean. I leaned forward slightly, invading her psychological space. I told her the tropical sun and the crystal champagne were permanently out of her reach. I stated she had traded a mansion for a cage, and now she could enjoy the absolute luxury of a freezing concrete floor for the rest of her miserable natural life. I turned my back on her weeping frame and walked to my seat. Judge Miller adjusted his glasses and looked down at the defendant with judicial disgust. He stated the sheer calculated brutality of the crimes presented a massive danger to the community. He declared the extensive offshore financial preparations proved she was an extreme flight risk. He raised his heavy wooden gavel and slammed it down with finality. He denied bail entirely and remanded the defendant to the maximum security federal detention center. The sharp crack signaled the absolute end of her manufactured empire. The armed bailiff stepped forward and grabbed Vanessa firmly by her arm. He yanked her away from the podium. She did not attempt to fight or scream. The feral energy had been drained from her veins. She let out a low, pathetic whimper as she dragged her bare feet across the cold linoleum. The bailiff marched her forcefully toward the reinforced holding cell door at the side of the courtroom. She stumbled over the threshold, disappearing into the dark institutional hallway. The bailiff pulled the thick steel door shut. The metallic slam echoed like thunder, sealing her fate permanently. I sat in the silent courtroom, letting the absolute justice of the moment wash over my exhausted bones. The threat was entirely neutralized. My bloodline was safe. I walked out of the building ready to return to my family. 30 days evaporated since the heavy steel door of the federal detention center slammed shut, permanently sealing the predator in her cage. The brutal Pacific Northwest winter yielded to the warming breath of early spring. The medical machinery that dictated every agonizing second of our existence was finally silenced. I stood in the pediatric intensive care unit and watched the nursing staff disconnect the final intravenous line from my granddaughter's arm. The surgical bandages wrapping her skull had been reduced to a sterile dressing covering the healing incision. Her deep brown eyes were clear, possessing a resilient light that defied the violent trauma she endured. The post-surgical seizures were entirely eradicated. Her neurological recovery defied every conservative medical projection the head surgeon had initially offered. She was walking with a slight limp, but her physical strength compounded with every passing hour. Javon wrapped a thick woolen coat over her shoulders and lifted her effortlessly into his arms. We walked out of the hospital, leaving the sterile nightmare behind us. The crisp morning air hit our faces, carrying the faint scent of damp earth. Aaliyah rested her head against her father's chest and smiled at the bright morning sun. The absolute darkest chapter of our lives was officially closed. Javon wasted no time eradicating the toxic remnants of his manufactured past. The sprawling Tacoma mansion that Vanessa utilized as a staging ground for her lethal extortion was placed on the aggressive real estate market. He ordered an elite moving crew to pack up only the essential items that belonged to Aaliyah. He instructed the brokers to liquidate the designer furniture, the imported artwork, and the luxury vehicles. He utilized every dollar from the accelerated property sale to establish a fortified ironclad trust fund exclusively in his daughter's name. The monument to his blind devotion was systematically dismantled and sold to the highest bidder within 14 days. He severed all physical and financial ties to the poisonous illusion he once called a marriage. We did not purchase another opulent estate. We secured a modest, highly fortified craftsman home nestled deep within a quiet wooded neighborhood. The architecture was simple, providing a warm, natural sanctuary entirely devoid of cold marble and echoing cavernous halls. I installed a state-of-the-art perimeter security matrix and heavy reinforced doors, ensuring the physical safety of my family. Javon moved his belongings into the room adjacent to Aaliyah's new bedroom. He stripped away his former dependencies and rebuilt his daily routine entirely around her medical recovery and emotional rehabilitation. The quiet, modest house quickly became an impenetrable fortress of genuine love and protection. The profound psychological devastation Javon experienced altered his internal architecture. The naive, trusting man who willingly handed a predator the keys to his financial kingdom was entirely eradicated. He demanded to learn the intricate mechanisms of my private investment firm. He started working directly under my supervision, occupying the desk directly across from my own. I did not offer him a comfortable executive sinecure or hollow titles. I forced him to analyze raw data, review encrypted financial ledgers, and track the flow of international capital. I taught him how to identify the subtle, hidden discrepancies that masked predatory corporate behavior. He absorbed the harsh, unyielding lessons of absolute accountability with a fierce, focused hunger. He learned the severe existential danger of blind trust and the absolute necessity of relentless vigilance. We spent countless hours dissecting complex investment portfolios in the quiet corners of the firm. The grueling professional labor served as a powerful therapeutic crucible. The shared trauma we endured during the hospital vigil forged an unbreakable iron bond between us. We no longer communicated through polite pleasantries. We spoke with the blunt efficiency of two veterans who survived a brutal, catastrophic war. I watched my son shed his manufactured complacency and forge himself into a hardened, capable protector. He assumed the heavy mantle of leadership with a quiet, determined dignity. He was no longer a target waiting to be exploited. He had become a vigilant apex predator fiercely dedicated to guarding his bloodline against any future threat. The late afternoon sun cast long golden shadows across the thick manicured grass of our new backyard. I sat in a heavy wooden rocking chair on the elevated back porch holding a ceramic mug of dark, bitter coffee. The ambient temperature was mild, carrying the faint, sweet fragrance of blooming jasmine from the garden beds. I took a slow, deliberate sip of the hot liquid and let my gaze drift across the peaceful domestic landscape. Aaliyah sat quietly on a woven blanket spread across the center of the lawn. She held a bright wooden palette smeared with vibrant acrylic colors. She dragged a thick brush across a large white canvas painting, a beautiful landscape of abstract shapes. Her melodic laughter rang out across the yard, chasing away the lingering ghosts of the Tacoma staircase. Her physical movements were fluid and energetic, showing no residual neurological deficits from the horrific fall. The cranial scar was completely hidden beneath her thick, dark curls. She was a miracle of human resilience. The heavy glass sliding door behind me opened with a soft metallic glide. Javon stepped out onto the wooden deck, carrying a small round cake covered in bright white frosting and a single unlit candle. He wore faded jeans and a simple cotton shirt, looking more relaxed and authentic than he had in 5 years. He walked to the edge of the porch and smiled down at his daughter. Aaliyah dropped her paintbrush and scrambled to her feet, clapping her hands with pure joy. She rushed across the lawn and threw her arms around his waist. Javon balanced the cake with one hand and smoothed her hair with the other, pressing a long kiss to the top of her head. He looked up and met my gaze across the wooden deck. His dark eyes held a profound gratitude. There were no lingering doubts and no hidden resentments. The toxic infection that had nearly destroyed our family was permanently excised from our reality. I rested my coffee mug on the small wooden table. I leaned back against the firm wooden slats and exhaled a long, steady breath. The tactical warfare was over. The offshore accounts were seized, the criminal syndicate was dismantled, and the predator was permanently rotting in a federal cage. The massive inherited fortune that attracted the vultures was now locked behind an impenetrable fortress of legal and financial armor. I watched my son carry the celebratory cake down the wooden steps toward my laughing granddaughter. The profound, heavy silence of the evening was not the tense, suffocating quiet of a pending ambush. It was the deep, resonant silence of absolute structural stability. The silent adjustment was completely executed. The fractured foundation of my family had been systematically shattered and rebuilt, utilizing unyielding iron and cold absolute truth. The vulnerabilities were eradicated and the perimeter was completely secure. I closed my eyes and let the warm, fading sunlight wash over my face. The predators had been aggressively hunted and destroyed. The pulse of my family was strong, steady, and undeniable. Order was finally and entirely restored. Authentic peace is never passively given, it is always aggressively built and secured. If you love this story of vengeance and justice, please subscribe to the channel and leave a comment below.